Alrighty, already, all Rudy. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we're going to continue with our grand undertaking of reading through the Hyperion Cantos by Dan Simmons. Last time we did our introductory chapter, and now we continue with our first character background story, entitled The Priest's Tale, The Man Who Cried God. So, going forward, that's probably how our stuff is going to be broken up, is middle chapter, which won't be very long, upwards of 20 pages, no more, which will be kind of like present day current events, and then the next week will be a character tale, because those are much beefier. Those are the meat of the thing. And I'm going to do it that way rather than cut one off in the middle, even though that would make sense for even time distribution. It doesn't really work for me emotionally, uh, and would interrupt one of these tales in the middle. And there's no easy way to bypass doing that other than me basically doing multiple streams a week, which is probably going to be what we're going to wind up doing at the start of the new year. My schedule is going to remain consistent, it looks like, for the foreseeable. So what could wind up happening, yeah, probably start of the new year. So on the 3rd of January. Oh, wow. Christmas is on Monday. I'm going to have to figure out something special to do with giant robots. As is New Year, because that's 1 week out from that. Interesting. Well, in that case, so yeah, probably start doing it that way. Because I've been planning on doing some changes to the overall format of my stream schedule anyway, and that would probably go pretty handily. So Wednesdays will become wordy Wednesdays, or wordful Wednesdays, something like that. Wordsmith Wednesdays, except I'm not smithing words. Anyway, probably that's what we'll do in order to simplify things. They'll all get put into the Hyperion playlist, which I'll have set up at the end of the month, or by the end of the month, I should say, for ease of finding things. I'm probably, if/when I wind up reading the Endymion duology, I'll make a new playlist for that one. But I'll combine the two. I'll have a combined playlist for both as well, which is needlessly complicated, but here we are. 5 odd years out now. I don't know how long I've been doing this exactly. Which reminds me, I still need to get around to making sure that my backups of my reading streams are current. Still haven't done that. Anyway, previously on Hyperion by Dan Simmons. We've been introduced to our cast of characters. We've been introduced lightly, in brief, to the consul. More on him much later. We've been introduced to the president, Mina Gladstone. We've been introduced to True Voice of the Tree, Het Mastine. We've been introduced to Braun Lamia, Lenar Hoyt, who's a priest, Fedman Kassad, who is a soldier with some infamous backstory we'll learn about eventually, Sol Weintraub, and the poet, Sol Weintraub, the scholar, and Martin Silenus, the poet. Been introduced to all these characters. Braun Lamia is a detective I'm not sure if they've mentioned that yet. If so, oops, but I don't think it's that big a spoiler. If it is, no, I think they do a one-off reference to, now I have to go skimming through here and see if I'm crazy. Every mention of Braun Lamia, and there is nothing about her being a PI. She is, anyway. Oh, here we go. Yes, they mentioned that she's a detective. So we're good. We're good. We've covered our bases. I haven't spoiled anything. Excellent. Things are about to get interesting. Anyway, um, this is also kind of this upcoming story is sort of an example of I had to tell you this story so I could tell you I had to tell you that story so I could tell you this one. But you uh, that will make sense later. All of these character stories basically are we need to tell you this story in order to tell you the next one, because that's just how it's structured. They are very revealing about the world that these characters live in. So get your puzzle boards out and start tacking pieces together, because the world of Hyperion is a puzzle. That's part of the fun of the book. Is there's some details that are not revealed until very late. Salient, important details that choose not to be revealed until very late, and then like recontextualize basically everything you knew about it, as many great narratives can do. They don't feel like total 180 bullshit though. So they don't feel like they come out of nowhere. There's enough build up to make and we're going to get a bunch of that in all of these. Like the first several of these character stories are going to be like, what the hell are you people talking about? How is all this in one universe? Uh, don't worry, we'll get there. That is a bookmark I do not want to lose. Let me put that over there. Okay. So yeah, we've been introduced to all of them. Um, as for what voice I'm going to do, because it's not necessarily going to be the voice of the same character, I've got to come up with a voice for Father Paul Duray. Very nice. So this is a multi-part character story about the backstory of Father Lenar Hoyt. Alrighty. Sit back, relax, stay toasty, and enjoy as we get rockin' and rollin' with The Priest's Tale, The Man Who Cried God. The Priest's Tale, The Man Who Cried God. Sometimes there is a thin line separating orthodox zeal from apostasy, said Father Lenar Hoyt. So began the priest's story. Later, dictating the tale into his comlog, the consul remembered it as a seamless whole, minus the pauses, hoarse voice, false starts, and small redundancies which were the timeless failings of human speech. Lenar Hoyt had been a young priest, born, raised, and only recently ordained on the Catholic world of Pacem, where he was given his first off-world assignment. He was ordered to escort the respected Jesuit father Paul Dure into quiet exile on the colony world of Hyperion. In another time, Father Paul Dure certainly would have become a bishop, and perhaps a pope. Tall, thin, ascetic, with white hair receding from a noble brow, and eyes too filled with the sharp edge of experience to hide their pain, Paul de Rey was a follower of St. Teilhard as well as an archaeologist, ethnologist, and eminent Jesuit theologian. Despite the decline of the Catholic Church into what amounted to a half-forgotten cult tolerated because of its quaintness and isolation from the mainstream of hegemony life, Jesuit logic had not lost its bite. Nor had Father de Rey lost his conviction that the Holy Catholic Apostolic Church continued to be humankind's last, best hope for immortality. To Lenar Hoyt as a boy, Father de Rey had been a somewhat godlike figure when glimpsed during his rare visits to the pre-seminary schools, or on the would-be seminarians' even rarer visits to the new Vatican. Then, during the years of Hoyt's study in seminary, de Rey had been on an important church-sponsored archaeological dig on the nearby world of Armagast. When the Jesuit returned, a few weeks after Hoyt's ordination, it had been under a cloud. No one outside the highest circles of the new Vatican knew precisely what had happened, but there were whispers of excommunication, and even of a hearing before the Holy Office of the Inquisition, dormant the 4 centuries since the confusion following the death of Earth. Instead, Father de Rey had asked for a posting to Hyperion, a world most people knew of only because of the bizarre Shrike cult which had originated there, and Father Hoyt had been chosen to accompany him. It would be a thankless job, traveling in a role which combined the worst aspects of apprentice, escort, and spy without even the satisfaction of seeing a new world. Hoyt was under orders to see Father de Rey down to the Hyperion spaceport and then reboard the same spin ship for its return voyage to the world web. What the bishopric was offering Lenar Hoyt was 20 months in cryogenic fugue, a few weeks of in-system travel at either end of the voyage, and a time debt which would return him to Pacem 8 years behind his former classmates in the quest for Vatican careers and missionary postings. Bound by obedience and schooled in discipline, Lenar Hoyt accepted without question. Their transport, the aging spin ship H.S. Nadia Oleg, was a pockmarked metal tub with no artificial gravity of any sort when it was not under drive, no viewports for the passengers, and no onboard recreation except for the stim sims piped into the data link to keep passengers in their hammocks and fugue couches. After awakening from fugue, the passengers, mostly off-world workers and economy-rate tourists with a few cult mystics and would-be Shrike suicides thrown in for good measure, slept in those same hammocks and fugue couches, ate recycled food in featureless mess decks, and generally tried to cope with space sickness and boredom during their 12-day zero-G glide from their spin-out point to Hyperion. Father Hoyt learned little from Father de Rey during those days of forced intimacy, learned nothing at all about the events on Armagast which had sent the senior priest into exile. The younger man had keyed his comlog implant to seek out as much data as it could on Hyperion, and by the time they were 3 days out from planetfall, Father Hoyt considered himself somewhat of an expert on the world. "There are records of Catholics coming to Hyperion, but no mention of a diocese there," said Hoyt one evening as they hung talking in their zero-G hammocks while most of their fellow passengers lay tuned in to erotic stim sims. "I presume you're going down to do some mission work?" "Not at all," replied Father de Rey. "The good people of Hyperion have done nothing to foist their religious opinions on me, and so I see no reason to offend them with my proselytizing. Actually, I hope to travel to the southern continent, Aquila, and then find a way inland from the city of Port Romance. but not in the guise of a missionary. I plan to set up an ethnological research station along the cleft."
Research?
Father Hoyt had echoed in surprise. He closed his eyes to key his implant. Looking again at Father Duray, he said,
That section of the Pinyon Plateau isn't habited, Father. The flame forests make it totally inaccessible most of the year.
Father Duray smiled and nodded. He carried no implant, and his ancient comlog had been in his luggage for the duration of the trip. "Not quite inaccessible," he said softly, "and not quite uninhabited. The Bikura live there."
Bikura, Father Hoyt said, and closed his eyes. But they're just a legend, he said at last.
Said Father Duray. "Try cross-indexing through Mamet Spedling." Father Hoyt closed his eyes again. General Index told him that Mamet Spedling had been a minor explorer affiliated with the Shackleton Institute on Renaissance Minor, who, after a standard century and a half earlier, almost a standard century and a half earlier, had filed a short report with the Institute in which he told of hacking his way inland from the then newly settled Port Romance, Port Romance, through swamplands which had since been reclaimed for fiberplastic plantations, passing through the flame forests during a period of rare quietude, and climbing high enough on the Pinyon Plateau to encounter the cleft, and a small tribe of humans who fit the profile of the legendary Bikura. Spedling's brief notes hypothesized that the humans were survivors of a missing seed ship colony from 3 centuries earlier, and clearly described a group suffering all of the classic retrograde cultural effects of extreme isolation, inbreeding, and over-adaptation. In Spedling's blunt words, "Even after less than 2 days here, it is obvious that the Bikura are too stupid, lethargic, and dull to waste time describing." As it turned out, the flame forests had then began to show some signs of becoming active, and Spedling had not wasted any more time observing his discovery, but had rushed to reach the coast, losing 4 indigene bearers, all of his equipment and records, and his left arm to the quiet forest in the 3 months it took him to escape.
My God, Father Hoyt had said, as he lay in his hammock on the Nadia Oleg. Why the Bikura?
"Why not?" had been Father Duray's mild reply. "Very little is known about them."
Very little is known about most of Hyperion, said the younger priest, becoming somewhat agitated. What about the time tombs and the legendary shrike north of the bridle range on Equus? He said. They're famous.
"Precisely," said Father Duray. "Lenar, how many learned papers have been written on the tombs and the shrike creature? Hundreds? Thousands?" The aging priest had tamped in tobacco and now lighted his pipe. No small feat in 0G, Hoyt observed. "Besides," said Paul Duray, "even if the shrike thing is real, it is not human. I am partial to human beings."
Yes, said Hoyt, ransacking his mental arsenal for potent arguments. But the Bikura are such a small mystery. At the most, you're going to find a few dozen indigenes living in a region so cloudy and smoky and unimportant that even the colony's own mapsats haven't noticed them. Why choose them when there are big mysteries to study on Hyperion, like the labyrinths? Hoyt had brightened. Do you know that Hyperion is one of the 9 labyrinthine worlds, Father?
"Of course," said Duray. A rough hemisphere of smoke expanded from him until air currents broke it into tendrils and tributaries. "But the labyrinths have their researchers and admirers throughout the web, Lenar, and the tunnels have been there, on all 9 worlds, for how long? 500,000 standard years? Closer to 750,000, I believe. Their secret will last. But how long will the Bikura culture last before they're absorbed into modern colonial society, or, more likely, are simply wiped out by circumstances?"
Hoyt shrugged. Perhaps they're already gone. It's been a long time since Spedling's encounter with them, and there haven't been any other confirmed reports. If they are extinct as a group, then all of your time, debt, and labor and pain of getting there will be for nothing.
"Precisely,"
was all that Father Paul de Rey had said, and puffed calmly on his pipe. It was in their last hour together, during the dropship ride down, that Father Hoyt had gained the slightest glimpse into his companion's thoughts. The limb of Hyperion had been glowing white and green and lapis above them for hours, when suddenly the old dropship had cut into the upper layers of atmosphere. Flame had briefly filled the window, and then they were flying silently some 60 kilometers above dark cloud masses and starlit seas, with the hurtling terminator of Hyperion's sunrise rushing toward them like a spectral tidal wave of light. "Marvelous!" Paul de Rey had whispered, more to himself than to his young companion. "Marvelous! It is at times like this that I have the sense, the slightest sense, of what a sacrifice it must have been for the Son of God to condescend to become the Son of Man." Hoyt had wanted to talk then, but Father de Rey had continued to stare out the window, lost in thought. 10 minutes later they had landed at Keats Interstellar. Father de Rey was soon swept into the whirlpool of customs and luggage rituals, and 20 minutes after that a thoroughly disappointed Lenar Hoyt was rising toward space and the Nadia Oleg once again. "5 weeks later of my time, I returned to Pachem," said Father Hoyt. "I had mislaid 8 years, but for some reason my sense of loss ran deeper than that simple fact. Immediately upon my return, the bishop informed me that there had been no word from Paul de Rey during the 4 years of his stay on Hyperion. The new Vatican had spent a fortune on fat-line inquiries, but neither the colonial authorities nor the consulate in Keats had been able to locate the missing priest." Hoyt paused to sip from his water-glass, and the consul said, "I remember the search. I never met de Rey, of course, but we did our best to trace him. Theo, my aide, spent a lot of energy over the years trying to solve the case of the missing cleric. Other than a few contradictory reports of sightings in Port Romance, there was no trace of him. And those sightings went back to the weeks right after his arrival, years before. There were hundreds of plantations out there with no radios or comm lines, primarily because they were harvesting bootleg drugs as well as fiber plastic. I guess we never talked to the people at the right plantation. At least I know Father de Rey's file was still open when I left." Father Hoyt nodded. "I landed in Keats a month after your replacement had taken over at the consulate. The bishop had been astonished when I volunteered to return. His Holiness himself granted me an audience. I was on Hyperion less than 7 of its local months. By the time I left to return to the web, I had discovered the fate of Father Paul de Rey." Hoyt tapped the 2 stained leather books on the table. "If I am to complete this," he said, his voice thick, "I must read excerpts from these." The tree ship Yggdrasil had turned so the bulk of the tree had blocked the sun. The effect was to plunge the dining platform and the curved canopy of leaves beneath it into night. But instead of a few thousand stars dotting the sky, as would have been the case from a planet's surface, literally a million suns blazed above, beside, and beneath the group at the table. Hyperion was a distinct sphere now, hurtling directly at them like some deadly missile. "Read," said Martin Silenus.
No, this is not a recording. This is very decidedly live. Thank you for tuning in, everybody who's tuned in. Warren, Steele, Frank Misers, and Trey Lenius. I may be mispronouncing any or all of those, and I apologize. Warren Steele says, I spent the last week listening to a great audiobook called Sandworm by Andy Greenberg. Absolutely terrifying story on Russian technological aggression towards Ukraine and the world's infrastructure. I will write that down right now. I will read anything. I've got a book in my backlog called Judgment at Tokyo, which is, and I'm sorry about this little aside, but I figure I try to catch these as I go as best I can. Sandworm.
Andy Greenberg. Thank you. I will check that one out. Disadvantage of doing this live is you get all the little quirks, pops, snarks, and pobbles, which aren't real words, of a live recording, including me making gasping noises every now and again when I decide to swallow my spit the wrong way. Hopefully not too much of that. Okay. From the Journal of Father Paul de Rey. Day 1. So begins my exile. I'm somewhat at a loss as to how to date my new journal. By the monastic calendar on Pacem, it is the 17th day of Thomas month in the year of our Lord 2732. By Hegemony Standard, it is October 12th, 589 PC. By Hyperion reckoning... Oh, whoops. October 12th, 589 PC. PC. By Hyperion reckoning, or so I am told by the wizened little clerk in the old hotel where I am staying, it is the 23rd day of Lycaeus, the last of their 7 40-day months. Either 426 ADC, after dropship crash, or the 128th year of the reign of sad King Billy, who has not reigned for at least 100 of those years. To hell with it. I'll call it day 1 of my exile. Exhausting day. Strange to be tired after months of sleep, but that is said to be a common reaction after awakening from a fugue. My cells feel the fatigue of these past months of travel, even if I do not remember them. I don't remember feeling this tired from travel when I was younger. I felt bad about not getting to know young Hoyt better. He seems a decent sort, all proper catechism and bright eyes. It's no fault of youngsters like him that the church is in its final days. It's just that his brand of happy naivete can do nothing to arrest that slide into oblivion which the church seems destined for. Well, my contributions have not helped either. Brilliant view of my new world as the dropship brought us down. I was able to make out 2 of the 3 continents, Equus and Aquila. The third one, Ursa, was not visible. Planetfall at Keats and hours of effort getting through customs and taking ground transit into the city. Confused images. The mountain range to the north with its shifting blue haze, foothills forested with orange and yellow trees, pale sky with its green-blue undercoating, the sun too small but more brilliant than Pacem's. Colours seem more vivid from a distance, dissolving and scattering as one approaches, like a pointillist's palette. The great sculpture of sad King Billy, which I had heard so much about, was oddly disappointing. Seen from the highway, it looked raw and rough, a hasty sketch chiselled from the dark mountain, rather than the regal figure I had expected. It does brood over this ramshackle city of 500,000 people in a way that the neurotic poet king probably would have appreciated. The town itself seems to be separated into the sprawling maze of slums and saloons which the locals call Jacktown, and Keats itself, the so-called Old City, although it dates back only 4 centuries, all polished stone and studied sterility. I will take the tour soon. I had scheduled a month in Keats, but already I am eager to press on. Oh, Monsignor Edouard, if you could see me now, punished but still unrepentant, more alone than ever, but strangely satisfied with my new exile. If my punishment for past excesses brought about by my zeal is to be banishment to the 7th circle of desolation, then Hyperion was well chosen. I could forget my self-appointed mission to the distant Bacura. Are they real? I think not this night. And content myself with living out the remainder of my years in this provincial capital on this god-forsaken backwater world. My exile would be no less complete. Ah, Edward, boys together, classmates together, although I was not so brilliant nor so orthodox as you. Now old men together. But now you are 4 years wiser, and I am still the mischievous, unrepentant boy you remember. I pray you are alive and well, and praying for me. Tired. Will sleep.
Tomorrow, take the tour of Keats, eat well, and arrange transport to Aquila, and point south. Day 5. There is a cathedral. Excuse me. There is a cathedral in Keats, or rather, there was one. It has been abandoned for at least 2 standard centuries. It lies in ruins, with its transept open to the green-blue skies, one of its western towers unfinished, and the other tower a skeletal framework of tumbled stone and rusted reinforcement rods. I stumbled upon it while wandering, lost, along the banks of the Hooghly River, in the sparsely populated section of town where the old city decays into Jacktown amid a jumble of tall warehouses, which prevent even a glimpse of the ruined towers of the cathedral until one turns a corner onto a narrow cul-de-sac, and there is the shell of the cathedral. And there is the shell of the cathedral. Its chapter house has half fallen away into the river. Its facade is pocked with the remnants of the mournful, apocalyptic statuary of post-Hegira expansionist period. Of the post-Hegira expansionist period. Sorry. Some of these lines or sentences are extremely wordy. I know, right? Words and sentences, crazy. I wandered through the latticework of shadows and fallen blocks into the nave. The bishopric on Pacem had not mentioned any history of Catholicism on Hyperion, much less the presence of a cathedral. It is almost inconceivable that the scattered sea-chip colony of 4 centuries ago could have supported a large enough congregation to warrant the presence of a bishop, much less a cathedral. Yet there it was. I poked through the shadows of the sacristy. Dust and powdered plaster hung in the air like incense, outlining 2 shafts of sunlight streaming down from narrow windows high above. I stepped out into a broader patch of sunlight and approached an altar stripped of all decoration except for chips and cracks caused by falling masonry. The great cross which had hung on the east wall behind the altar had also fallen, and now lay in ceramic splinters among the heap of stones there. Without conscious thought, I stepped behind the altar, raised my arms, and began the celebration of the Eucharist. There was no sense of parody or melodrama in this act, no symbolism or hidden intention. It was merely the autonomic reaction of a priest who has said Mass almost daily for more than 46 years of his life, and who now faced skipped a page. And who now faced the prospect of never again participating in the reassuring ritual of that celebration. It was with some shock that I realized I had a congregation. The old woman was kneeling in the 4th row of pews. The black of her dress and scarf blended so perfectly with the shadows that there was only the pale oval of that only. Let's try that sentence again from the top, shall we? The black of her dress and scarf blended so perfectly with the shadows that there were that. Oh, that's why it's throwing me. I see. The black of her dress and scarf blended so perfectly with the shadows there that only the pale oval of her face was visible, lined and ancient, floating disembodied in the darkness. Startled, I stopped speaking the litany of consecration. She was looking at me, but something about her eyes, even at a distance, instantly convinced me that she was blind. For a moment I could not speak, and stood there mute, squinting in the dusty light bathing the altar, trying to explain this spectral image to myself, while at the same time attempting to frame an explanation of my own presence and actions. When I did find my voice and called to her, the words echoing in the great hall, I realized that she had moved. I could hear her feet scraping the stone floor. There was a rasping sound, and then a brief flare of light illuminated her profile far to the right of the altar. I shielded my eyes from the shafts of sunlight, and began picking my way over the detritus where the altar railing had once stood. I called to her again, offered reassurances, and told her not to be afraid, even though it was I who had chills coursing up my back. I moved quickly, but when I reached the sheltered corner of the nave, she was gone. A small door led to the crumbling chapter house and the river bank. There was no sight of her. I returned to the dark interior, and would have gladly attributed her appearance to my, imagination. A waking dream after so many months of enforced cryogenic dreamlessness. But for a single tangible proof of her presence. There in the cool darkness burned a lone red votive candle, its tiny flame flickering to unseen draughts and currents. I am tired of this city. I am tired of its pagan pretensions and false histories. Hyperion is a poet's world, devoid of poetry. Keats itself is a mixture of tawdry, false classicism and mindless boomtown energy. There are 3 Zen Gnostic assemblies and 4 high Muslim mosques in the town, but the real houses of worship are the countless saloons and brothels, the huge marketplace handling the fiber plastic shipments from the south, and the Shrike cult temples, where lost souls hide their suicidal hopelessness behind a shield of shallow mysticism. The whole planet reeks of mysticism without revelation. To hell with it. Tomorrow I head south. There are skimmers and other aircraft on this absurd world, but, for the common folk, travel between these accursed island continents seems restricted to boat, which takes forever, I am told, or one of the huge passenger dirigibles which departs from Keats only once a week. I leave early tomorrow by dirigible. Day 10. Animals. The first down team for this planet must have had a fixation on animals. Horse, bear, eagle. For 3 days we were creeping down the east coast of Equus over an irregular coastline called the Main. We've spent the last day making the crossing of a short span of the Middle Sea to a large island called Cat Key. Today we are offloading passengers and freight at Felix, the major city of the island. From what I can see from the observation promenade and the mooring tower, there can't be more than 5,000 people living in that random collection of hovels and barracks. Next, the ship will make its 800-kilometer crawl down a series of smaller islands called the Nine Tails, and then take a bold leap across 700 kilometers of open sea and the equator. The next land we see then is the northwest coast of Aquila, the so-called Beak. Animals. To call this conveyance a passenger dirigible is an exercise in creative semantics. It is a huge lifting device with cargo holds large enough to carry the town of Felix out to sea and still have room for thousands of bales of fiber plastic. Meanwhile, the less important cargo, we passengers, make do where we can. I have set up a cot near the aft loading portal and made a rather comfortable niche for myself with my personal luggage and 3 large trunks of expedition gear. Near me is a family of 8, indigene plantation workers returning from a biannual shopping expedition of their own to Keats, and although I do not mind the sound or scent of their caged pigs or the squeal of their food hamsters, the incessant, confused crowing of their poor, befuddled rooster is more than I can stand some nights. Animals! Day 11. Dinner tonight in the salon above the promenade deck with citizen Heramis Denzel, a retired professor from a small planters' college near Endymion. He informed me that the Hyperion first down team had no animal fetish after all. The official names of the 3 continents are not Equus, Ursa, and Aquila, but Creighton, Allenson, and Lopez. He went on to say that this was in honor of 3 middle-level bureaucrats in the old survey service. Better the animal fetish. It is after dinner. I am alone on the outside promenade to watch the sunset. The walkway here is sheltered by the forward cargo modules, so the wind is little more than a salt-tinged breeze. Above me curves the orange and green skin of the dirigible. We are between islands. The sea is a rich lapis, shot through with verdant undertones, a reversal of sky tones. A scattering of high cirrus catches the last light of Hyperion's too small sun and ignites like burning coral. There is no sound except for the faintest hum of the electric turbines. 300 meters below, the shadow of a huge manta-like undersea creature keeps pace with the dirigible. A second ago, an insect or bird the size and colour of a hummingbird, but with gossamer wings a metre across, paused 5 metres out to inspect me before diving toward the sea with folded wings. Edward, I feel very alone tonight. It would help if I knew you were still alive, still working in the garden, writing evenings in your study. I thought my travels would stir my old beliefs in St. Teilhard's concept of the God in whom the Christ of evolution, the personal, the universe and the universal, the en haut and the en avant are joined. But no such renewal is forthcoming. It is growing dark. I am growing old. I feel something, not yet remorse, at my sin of falsifying the evidence of the Armagast dig. But, Edward, your Excellency, if the artifacts had indicated the presence of a Christ-oriented culture there, 600 light-years from old Earth, almost 3,000 years before man had left the surface of the homeworld, was it so dark a sin to interpret such ambiguous data in a way which could have meant the resurgence of Christianity in our lifetime? Yes, it was. But not, I think, because of the sin of tampering with the data, but the deeper sin of thinking that Christianity could be saved. The Church is dying, Edward, and not merely our beloved branch of the holy and not merely our beloved branch of the holy tree, but all of its offshoots, vestiges, and cankers. The entire body of Christ is dying as surely as this poorly used body of mine. Edward, you and I knew this in Armagast, where the blood sun illuminated only dust and death. We knew it in that cool, green summer at the college when we took our first vows. We knew it as boys in the quiet playfields of Villefranche-sur-Saône. We know it now. Yes, I should be doing it with a French accent. No, I'm not going to do it. It'd be exhausting. The light is gone now. I must write by the slight glow from the salon windows a deck above. The stars lie in strange constellations. The middle sea glows at night with a greenish, unhealthy phosphorescence. There is a dark mass on the horizon to the southeast. It may be a storm, or it may be the next island in the chain, the third of the 9 tails. What mythology deals with a cat with 9 tails? I know of none. For the sake of the bird I saw earlier, if it was a bird, I pray that it is an island ahead, and not a storm. Day 28. I've been in Port Romance 8 days, and I have seen 3 dead men. The first was a beached corpse, a bloated, white parody of a man that had washed up on the mud flats beyond the mooring tower my first evening in town. Children threw stones at it. The second man I watched being pulled from the burned wreckage of a methane unit shop in the poor section of town near my hotel. His body was charred beyond recognition and shrunken by the heat, his arms and legs pulled tight in the prize-fighter posture burning victims have been reduced to since time immemorial. I had been fasting all day, and I confess with shame that I began to salivate when the air filled with the rich, frying fat odour of burned flesh. The third man was murdered not 3 meters from me. I had just emerged from the hotel onto the maze of mud-splattered planks that serve as sidewalks in this miserable town, when shots rang out, and a man several paces ahead of me lurched, as if his foot had slipped, spun toward me with a quizzical look on his face, and fell sideways into the mud and sewage. He had been shot 3 times with some sort of projectile weapon. 2 of the bullets had struck his chest, the third entered just below the left eye. Incredibly, he was still breathing when I reached him. Without thinking about it, I removed my stole from my carrying bag, fumbled for the vial of holy water I had carried for so long, and proceeded to perform the sacrament of extreme unction. No one in the gathering crowd objected. The fallen man stirred once, cleared his throat as if he were about to speak, and died. The crowd dispersed even before the body was removed. The man was middle-aged, sandy-haired, and slightly overweight. He carried no identification, not even a universal card or comlog. There were 6 silver coins in his pocket. For some reason, I elected to stay with the body the rest of the day. The doctor was a short and cynical man who allowed me to stay during the required autopsy. I suspect that he was starved for conversation.
"This is what the whole thing's worth," he said, as he opened the poor man's belly like a pink satchel, pulling the folds of skin and muscle back and pinning them down like tent flaps.
"What thing?" I asked.
"His life,"
said the doctor, and pulled the skin of the corpse's face up and back like a greasy mask.
"Your life. My life."
The red and white stripes of overlapping muscle turned to blue bruise around the ragged hole just above the cheekbone.
"There has to be more than this,"
I said. The doctor looked up from his grim work with a bemused smile.
"Is there?"
he said.
"Please, show me."
He lifted the man's heart and seemed to weigh it in one hand.
"In the web worlds, this'd be worth some money on the open market. There are those too poor to keep vat-grown cloned parts on store, but too well off to die just for want of a heart. But out here, it's just awful."
"There has to be more,"
I said, although I felt little conviction. I remembered the funeral of His Holiness Pope Urban XV shortly before I left Pacem. As has been the custom since pre-Hegira days, the corpse was not embalmed. It waited in the anteroom off the main basilica to be fitted for the plain wooden coffin. As I helped Edouard and Monsignor Frey place the vestments on the stiffened corpse, I noticed the browning skin and slackening mouth. The doctor shrugged and finished the perfunctory autopsy. There was the briefest of formal inquiries. No suspect was found, no motive put forward. A description of the murdered man was sent to Keats, but the man himself was buried the next day in a pauper's field between the mudflats and the yellow jungle. Port Romance is a jumble of yellow, weirwood structures set on a maze of scaffolds and planks stretching far out onto the tidal mudflats at the mouth of the Khans. The river is almost 2 kilometers wide here, where it spills out into Toshahai Bay, but only a few channels are navigable, and the dredging goes on day and night. I lie awake each night in my cheap room with the window open to the pounding of the dredge hammer, sounding like the booming of this vile city's heart, the distant susurration of the surf its wet breathing. Tonight I listen to the city breathe, and cannot help but give it the flayed face of the murdered man. The companies keep a skimmer port on the edge of town to ferry men and materiel inland to the larger plantations, but I do not have enough money to bribe my way aboard. Rather, I could get myself aboard, but cannot afford to transport my 3 trunks of medical and scientific gear. I am still tempted. My service among the Bikura seems more absurd and irrational now than ever before. Only my strange need for a destination and a certain masochistic determination to complete the terms of my self-imposed exile keep me moving upriver. There is a river-boat departing up the Khans in 2 days. I have booked passage, and will move my trunks onto it tomorrow. It will not be hard to leave Port Romance behind. Day 41. Oh boy. The Emporotic Girandole continues its slow progress upriver. That's the name of the boat. No sight of human habitation since we left Melton's Landing 2 days ago. The jungle presses down to the riverbank like a solid wall now. More, it almost completely overhangs us in places where the river narrows to 30 or 40 meters. The light itself is yellow, rich as liquid butter, filtered as it is through foliage and fronds easily. Oh, sorry, that's 80. Foliage and fronds 80 meters above the brown surface of the Khans. I sit on the rusted tin roof of the center passenger barge and strain to make out my first glimpse of a Tesla tree. Old Cady, sitting nearby, pauses in his whittling, spits over the side through a gap in his teeth, and laughs at me.
"Ain't gonna be no flame trees this far down," he says. If they was, the forest sure as hell wouldn't look like this. You got to get up in the pinions before you see a Tesla. We ain't out of the rainforest yet, Padre.
It rains every afternoon. Actually, rain is too gentle a term for the deluge that strikes us each day, obscuring the shore, pounding the tin roofs of the barges with a deafening roar, and slowing our upstream crawl until it seems we are standing still. It is as if the river becomes a vertical torrent each afternoon, a waterfall which the ship must climb if we are to go on. The girandole is an ancient flat-bottomed tow, with 5 barges lashed around it like ragged children clinging to their tired mothers' skirts. 3 of the 2-level barges that's 2-level, barges with 2 levels. 3 of the 2-level barges carry bales of goods to be traded or sold at the few plantations and settlements along the river. The other 2 offer a simulacrum of lodging for the indigenes travelling upriver, although I suspect that some of the barge's residents are permanent. My own berth boasts a stained mattress on the floor and lizard-like insects on the walls. After the rains, everyone gathers on the decks to watch the evening mists rise from the cooling river. The air is very hot and supersaturated. Whoa, wrong page. Supersaturated with moisture most of the day now. Old Cady tells me that I have come too late to make the climb through the rain and flame forests before the Tesla trees become active. We shall see. Tonight the mists rise like the spirits of all the dead who sleep beneath the river's dark surface. The last tattered remnants of the afternoon's cloud cover dissipate through the treetops, and colour returns to the world. I watch as the dense forest shifts from chrome yellow to a translucent saffron, and then slowly fades through ochre to umber to gloom. Aboard the girandole, old Cady lights the lanterns and candle globes hanging from the sagging second tier, and, as if not to be outdone, the darkened jungle begins to glow with the faint phosphorescence of decay, while glowbirds and multi-hued gossamers can be seen floating from branch to branch in the darker upper regions. Hyperion's small moon is not visible tonight, but this world moves through more debris than is common for a planet so close to its sun, and the night skies are illuminated by frequent meteor showers. Tonight the heavens are especially fertile, and we move onto wide sections of the river. And when we move onto wide sections of the river, we can see a tracery of brilliant meteor trails weaving the stars together. Their images burn the retina after a while, and I look down at the river only to see the same optic echo there in the dark waters. There is a bright glow on the eastern horizon, and old Cady tells me that this is from the orbital mirrors, which give light to a few of the larger plantations. It is too warm to return to my cabin. I spread my thin mat on the rooftop of my barge and watch the celestial light show while clusters of indigene families sing haunting songs in an argot I have not even tried to learn. I wonder about the Bikura, still far away from here, and a strange anxiety rises in me. Somewhere in the forest an animal screams with the voice of a frightened woman. Day 60. Arrived Perusal Plantation. Sick. Day 62. Very ill. Fever. Fits of shaking. All yesterday I was vomiting black bile. The rain is deafening. At night the clouds are lit from above by orbital mirrors. The sky seems to be on fire. My fever is very high. A woman takes care of me, bathes me, too sick to be ashamed. Her hair is darker than most indigenes. She says little. Dark, gentle eyes. Oh, God, to be sick so far from home. Day. She is waiting, spying, comes in from the rain, the thin shirt, on purpose to tempt me, knows what I am, the skin burning on fire, thin cotton nipples against it. I know who they are watching. Hear their voices at night, they bathe me in poison burns me. They think I don't know, but I hear their voices above the rain when they're screaming, stop, stop, stop. My skin is almost gone. Red underneath, can feel the hole in my cheek. When I find the bullet, I will spit it out. Agnus Dei, quid olis specialis catamundi, miserere nobis, miserere nobis, miserere. Day 65. Thank you, dear Lord, for deliverance from illness. Day 66. Shaved today. Was able to make it to the shower. Semper helped me prepare for the administrator's visit. I expected him to be one of the large, gruff types I have seen out the window working in the sorting compound, but he was a quiet black man with a slight lisp. He was most helpful. I had been concerned about paying for my medical care, but he reassured me that there would be no charge. Even better, he will assign a man to lead me into the high country. He says it is late in the season, but if I can travel in 10 days, we should be able to make it through the flame forest to the cleft before the Tesla trees are fully active. After he left, I sat and talked to Semper a bit. Her husband died here 3 local months ago in a harvesting accident. Semper herself has come from Port Romance. Her marriage to Michael had been a salvation for her, and she has chosen to stay on here doing odd jobs rather than go back downriver. I do not blame her. After a massage, I will sleep. Many dreams about my mother recently. 10 days. I will be ready in 10 days. Day 75. Before leaving with Took, I went down to the Matrix Paddies to say goodbye to Semper. She said little, but I could see in her eyes that she was sad to see me go. Without premeditation, I blessed her and then kissed her on the forehead. Took stood nearby, smiling and bobbing. Then we were off, leading the 2 pack-birds. Supervisor Orlandi came to the end of the road and waved as we entered the narrow lane hacked into the aureate foliage. Domine dirige nos. Day 82. After a week on the trail, what trail? After a week in the trackless yellow rainforest, after a week of exhausting climb up the ever steeper shoulder of the Pinyon Plateau, we emerged this morning onto a rocky outcropping that allowed us a view back across an expanse of jungle toward the Beak and the Middle Sea. The plateau here is almost 3,000 meters above sea level, and the view was impressive. Heavy rain clouds spread out below us to the foot of the Pinyon Hills, but through gaps in the white and grey carpet of cloud we caught glimpses of the Khans in its leisurely uncoiling toward Port R and the sea, chrome-yellow swatches of the forest we had struggled through, and a hint of magenta far to the east that Took swore was the lower matrix of fiberplastic fields near Perusal. We continued onward and upward late into the evening. Took is obviously worried that we will be caught in the flame forests when the Tesla trees become active. I struggle to keep up, tugging at the heavily laden brid and saying silent prayers to keep my mind off my aches, pains, and general misgivings. Day 83. Loaded and moving before dawn today. The air smells of smoke and ashes. The change in vegetation here on the plateau is startling. No longer evident are the ubiquitous weirwood and leafy chalma. After passing through an intermediate zone of short evergreens and everblues, then after climbing again through dense strands of mutated lodgepole pines and triaspen, we came into the flame forest proper with its groves of tall Prometheus, trailers of ever-present phoenix, and round stands of amber lambents. Occasionally we encountered impenetrable breaks of the white fibrous bifurcated bestos plants that Took picturesquely referred to as "looking like de rotten cocks of some dead giants what be buried shallow here, dat be sure." My guide has a way with words. It was late afternoon before we saw our first Tesla tree. For half an hour we had been trudging over an ash-covered forest floor, trying not to tread on the tender shoots of phoenix and firewhip, gamely pushing up through the sooty soil, when suddenly Took stopped and pointed. The Tesla tree, still half a kilometre away, stood at least 100 meters tall, half again as high as the tallest Prometheus. Near its crown it bulged with the distinctive onion-shaped dome of its accumulator gall. The radial branches above the gall trailed dozens of nimbus vines, each looking silver and metallic against the clear green and lapis sky. The whole thing made me think of some elegant high Muslim mosque on New Mecca, irreverently garlanded with tinsel. "We got to get de brids and our asses de hell out of here," grunted Took. He insisted that we change into flame forest gear right then and there. We spent the rest of the afternoon and evening trudging on in our osmosis masks and thick, rubber-soled boots, sweating under layers of leathery gamma cloth. Both of the brids acted nervous, their long ears pricking at the slightest sound. Even through my mask I could smell the ozone. It reminded me of electric trains I had played with as a child on lazy Christmas Day afternoons in Villefranche-sur-Saône. We are camping as close as we can to asbestos break this night. Took showed me how to set out the ring of arrestor rods, all the time clucking dire warnings to himself and searching the evening sky for clouds. I plan to sleep well in spite of everything. Day 84. 0400 hours. Sweet Mother of Christ. For 3 hours we have been caught up in the middle of the end of the world. The explosions started shortly after midnight, mere lightning crashes at first, and against our better judgment, Took and I slid our heads through the tent flap to watch the pyrotechnics. I am used to the Matthew-month monsoon storms on Pachem, so the first hour of lightning displays did not seem too unusual. Only the sight of distant Tesla trees as the unerring focus of the aerial discharge was a bit unnerving. But soon the forest behemoths were glowing and spitting with their own accumulated energy, and then, just as I was drifting off to sleep despite the continued noise, true Armageddon was unleashed. At least 100 arcs of electricity must have been released in the first 10 seconds of the Tesla tree's opening spasms of violent energy. A Prometheus less than 30 meters from us exploded, dropping flaming brands 50 meters to the forest floor. The arrestor rods glowed, hissed, and deflected arc after arc of blue-white death over and around our small campsite. Took screamed something, but no mere human sound was audible over the onslaught of light and noise. A patch of trailing phoenix burst into flame near the tethered brids, and one of the terrified animals, hobbled and blindfolded as it was, broke free and lunged through the circle of glowing arrestor rods. Instantly, half a dozen bolts of lightning from the nearest Tesla arced to the hapless animal. For a mad second I could have sworn I saw the beast's skeleton glowing through boiling flesh, and then it spasmed high into the air and simply ceased to be. For 3 hours we have watched the end of the world. 2 of the arrestor rods have fallen, but the other 8 continue to function. Took and I huddle in the hot cave of our tent, osmosis masks filtering enough cool oxygen out of the superheated, smoky air to allow us to breathe. Only the lack of undergrowth and Took's skill in placing our tent away from other targets and near the sheltering bestos plants have allowed us to survive. That and the 8 whiskered alloy rods that stand between us and eternity.
They seem to be holding up well,
I shout to Took over the hiss and crackle, crash and split of the storm.
"They be made to stand the hour, maybe 2, grunts my guide. Any time, maybe sooner they fuse, we die."
I nod and sip at lukewarm water through the slip strip of my osmosis mask. If I survive this night, I shall always thank God for his generosity in allowing me to see this sight. Day 87. Took and I emerged from the smouldering northeastern edge of the flame forest at noon yesterday, promptly set up camp by the edge of a small stream, and slept for 18 hours straight, making up for 3 nights of no sleep and 2 grueling days moving without rest through a nightmare of flame and ash. Everywhere we looked as we approached the hogback ridge that marked the terminus of the forest, we could see seed pods and cones burst open with new life for the various fire species that had died in the conflagration of the previous 2 nights. 5 of our arrestor rods still functioned, although neither Took nor I was eager to test them another night. Our surviving pack-brid collapsed and died the instant the heavy load was lifted off its back. I awoke this morning at dawn to the sound of running water. I followed the small stream a kilometre to the northeast, following a deepening in its sound, until suddenly it dropped from sight. The cleft. I had almost forgotten our destination. This morning, stumbling through the fog, leaping from one wet rock to another alongside the widening stream, I took a leap to a final boulder, teetered there, regained my balance, and looked straight down above a waterfall that dropped almost 3,000 meters to mist, rock, and river far below. The cleft was not carved out of the rising plateau, as was the legendary Grand Canyon on Old Earth, or the World Crack on Hebron. In spite of its active oceans and seemingly Earth-like continents, Hyperion is tectonically quite dead, more like Mars, Lucis, or Armagast in its total lack of continental drift. And, like Mars and Lucis, Hyperion is afflicted with its deep ice ages, although here the periodicity is spread to 37 million years by the long ellipse of the currently absent binary dwarf. The comlog compares the cleft to the pre-terraformed Mariner Valley on Mars, both being caused by the weakening of crust through periodic freeze and thaw over the eons, followed by the flow of subterranean rivers such as the Khans. Then the massive collapse, running like a long scar through the mountainous wing of the continent Aquila. Took joined me as I stood on the edge of the cleft. I was naked, rinsing the ash smell from my travelling clothes and cassock. I splashed cold water over my pale flesh, and laughed out loud as the echoes of Took's shouts came back from the north wall, 2/3 of a kilometre away. Because of the nature of the crust collapse, Took and I stood far out on an overhang that hid the south wall below us. Although perilously exposed, we assumed that the rocky cornice which had defied gravity for millions of years, would last a few more hours as we bathed, relaxed, shouting echoing halloos until we were hoarse, and generally acted like children liberated from school. Took confessed that he had never penetrated the full width of the flame forest, nor known anyone who had in this season, and announced that, now that the Tesla trees were becoming fully active, he would have at least a 3-month wait until he could return. He did not seem too sorry, and I was glad to have him with me. In the afternoon we transported my gear in relays, setting up camp near the stream 100 meters back from the cornice, and stacking my flow foam boxes of scientific gear for further sorting in the morning. It was cold this evening. After dinner, just before sunset, I pulled on my thermal jacket and walked alone to a rocky ledge southwest of where I had first encountered the cleft. From my vantage point, far out over the river, the view was memorable. Mists rose from unseen waterfalls, tumbling to the river far below, spray rising in shifting curtains of mist to multiply the setting sun into a dozen violet spheres and twice that many rainbows. I watched as each spectrum was born, rose toward the darkening dome of sky, and died. As the cooling air settled into the cracks and caverns of the plateau, and the warm air rushed skyward, pulling leaves, twigs, and mist upward in a vertical gale, a sound ebbed up out of the cleft, as if the continent itself was calling with the voices of stone giants, gigantic bamboo flutes, church organs the size of palaces, the clear, perfect notes ranging from the shrillest soprano to the deepest bass. I speculated on wind vectors against the fluted rock walls, on caverns far below venting deep cracks in the motionless crust, and on the illusion of human voices that random harmonics can generate. But in the end I set aside speculation and simply listened as the cleft sang its farewell hymn to the sun. I walked back to our tent and its circle of bioluminescent lantern light as the first fusillade of meteor showers burned the skies overhead, and distant explosions from the flame forests rippled along the southern and western horizons like cannon fire from some ancient war on pre-Hegira old Earth. Once in the tent I tried the long-range comlog bands, but there is nothing but static. I suspect that even if the primitive comsats that serve the fiberplastic plantations were ever to broadcast this far east, anything but the tightest laser or fatline beam would be masked by the mountains and Tesla activity. On Pacham, few of us at the monastery wore or carried personal comlogs, but the datasphere was always there if we needed to tap into it. Here, there is no choice. I sit and listen to the last notes from the canyon wind die, watch the skies simultaneously darken and blaze, smile at the sound of Took's snoring from his bedroll outside the tent, and I think to myself, if this is exile, so be it. Day 88. Took is dead. Murdered. I found his body when I left the tent at sunrise. He had been sleeping outside, not more than 4 meters from me. He had said that he wished to sleep under the stars. The murderers cut his throat while he slept. I heard no cry. I did dream, however, dreams of Sempha ministering to me during my fever. Dreams of cool hands touching my neck and chest, touching the crucifix I have worn since childhood. I stood over Took's body, staring at the wide, dark circle where his blood had soaked into Hyperion's uncaring soil, and I shivered at the thought that the dream had been more than a dream, that hands had touched me in the night. I confess that I reacted more like a frightened old fool than as a priest. I did administer extreme unction, but then the panic struck me as I left my poor guide's body, desperately searched through the supplies for a weapon, and took away the machete I had used in the rainforest, and the low-voltage mazer which I had planned to hunt small game. With which I had planned to hunt small game. Whether I would have used a weapon on a human being, even to save my own life, I do not know. But, in my panic, I carried the machete, the mazer, and the powered binoculars to a high boulder near the cleft, and searched the region for any signs of the murderers. Nothing stirred except the tiny arboreals and gossamers we had seen flitting through the trees yesterday. The forest itself seemed abnormally thick and dark. The cleft offered 100 terraces, ledges, and rock balconies to the northeast for entire bands of savages. An army could have hidden there in the crags and ever-present mists. After 30 minutes of fruitless vigilance and foolish cowardice, I returned to the campsite and prepared Took's body for burial. It took me well over 2 hours to dig a proper grave in the rocky soil of the plateau. When it was filled and the formal service was finished, I could think of nothing personal to say about the rough, funny little man who had been my guide. "Watch over him, my lord," I said at last, disgusted at my own hypocrisy, sure in my heart that I was mouthing words only to myself. "Give him safe passage. Amen." This evening I have moved my camp half a kilometre north. My tent is pitched in an open area 10 meters away, but I am wedged with my back against the boulder, sleeping robes pulled around, the machete and mazer nearby. After Took's funeral, I went through the supplies and boxes of equipment. Nothing had been taken except for the few remaining arrestor rods. Immediately, I wondered if someone had followed us through the flame forest in order to kill Took and strand me here, but I could think of no motive for such an elaborate action. Anyone from the plantations could have killed us as we slept in the rainforest, or better yet, from a murderer's point of view, deep in the flame forest, where no one would wonder at 2 charred corpses. That left the Bikura, my primitive chargers. I considered returning through the flame forest without the rods, but soon abandoned the idea. It is probable death to stay, and certain death to go. 3 months before the Teslas become dormant. 120 of the 26-hour local days. An eternity. Dear Christ, why has this come to me? And why was I spared last night, if I am merely to be offered up this night? If I am merely to be offered up this night, or next? I sit in the darkening crag, and I listen to the suddenly ominous moaning rising with the night wind from the cleft, and I pray as the sky lights with the blood-red streaks of meteor trails, mouthing words to myself. Day 95. The terrors of the past week have largely abated. I find that even fear fades and becomes commonplace after days of anticlimax. I used the machete to cut small trees for a lean-to, covering the roof and side with gamma cloth and caulking between the logs with mud. The back wall is the solid stone of the boulder. I have sorted through my research gear and set some of it out, although I suspect that I will never use it now. I have begun foraging to supplement my quickly diminishing cache of freeze-dried food. By now, according to the absurd schedule drawn up so long ago on Pachem, I was to have been living with the Bikura for some weeks, and trading small goods for local food. No matter. Besides my diet of bland but easily boiled chalma roots, I have found half a dozen varieties of berries and larger fruits that my comlog assures me are edible. So far, only one has disagreed with me enough to keep me squatting all night near the edge of the nearest ravine. I pace the confines of the region as restlessly as one of those caged pelops that were so prized by the minor padishahs on Armagast. A kilometre to the south and 4 to the west, the flame forests are in full form. In the morning, smoke vies with the shifting curtains of mist to hide the sky. Only the near-solid breaks of Bestus, the rocky soil here on the summit plateau, and the hogback ridges running like armor-plated vertebrae northeast from here keep the Teslas at bay. To the north, the plateau widens out, and the undergrowth becomes denser near the cleft for some 15 kilometres, until the way is blocked by a ravine a third as deep and half as wide as the cleft itself. Yesterday I reached this northernmost point and stared across the gaping barrier with some frustration. I will try again some day, detouring to the east to find a crossing point, but from the telltale signs of Phoenix across the chasm and the pall of smoke along the northeastern horizon, I suspect I will find only the chalma-filled canyons and steppes of flame forest that are roughed in on the orbital survey map I carry. Tonight I visited Took's rocky grave as the evening wind began to wail its Aeolian dirge. I knelt there and tried to pray, but nothing came. Edward, nothing came. I am as empty as those fake sarcophagi that you and I unearthed by the score from the sterile desert sands near Tarum Bel Wadi. The Zen Gnostics would say that this emptiness is a good sign, that it presages openness to a new level of awareness, new insights, new experiences. Merde. My emptiness is only emptiness. Day 96. I have found the Bikura. Or rather, they have found me. I will write what I can before they come to rouse me from my sleep. Today I was doing some detail mapping a mere 4 kilometres north of camp when the mists lifted in the midday warmth, and I noticed a series of terraces on my side of the cleft that had been hidden until then. I was using my powered glasses to inspect the terraces, actually a series of laddered ledges, spires, shelves, and tussocks extending far out onto the overhang, when I realized that I was staring at man-made habitations. The dozen or so huts were crude, rough hovels of heaped chalmer fronds, stones, and sponge turf, but they were unmistakably of human origin. I was standing there irresolute, binoculars still lifted, trying to decide whether to climb down to the exposed ledges and confront the inhabitants, or to retreat to my camp, when I felt that lifting chill along the back and neck that tells one with absolute certainty that he is no longer alone. I lowered the binoculars and turned slowly. The Bikura were there, at least 30 of them, standing in a semicircle that left me no retreat to the forest. I do not know what I expected. Naked savages, perhaps, with fierce expressions and necklaces of teeth. Perhaps I had half expected to find the kind of bearded, wild-haired hermits that travellers sometimes encountered in the Moshe Mountains on Hebron. Whatever I held in mind, the reality of the Bikura did not fit the template. The people who had approached me so silently were short. None came higher than my shoulder, and swathed in roughly woven dark robes that covered them from neck to toe. When they moved, as some did now, they seemed to glide over the ground like wraiths. From a distance their appearance reminded me of nothing so much as a gaggle of diminutive Jesuits at a new Vatican enclave. I almost giggled then, but realized that such a response might well be a sign of rising panic. The Bikura showed no outward signs of aggression to cause such a panic. They carried no weapons, their small hands were empty as their expressions. Their physiognomy is hard to describe succinctly. They are bald, all of them. That baldness, the absence of any facial hair, and the loose robes that fell in a straight line to the ground, all conspired to make it very difficult to tell the men from the women. The group now confronting me, more than 50 by this time, looked to be all of roughly the same age, somewhere between 40 and 50 standard years. Their faces were smooth, the skin tinged with a yellowish cast that I guessed might be associated with generations of ingesting trace minerals in the chalma and other local plant life. One might be tempted to describe the round faces of the Bikura as cherubic until, upon closer inspection, that impression of sweetness fades and is replaced by another interpretation: placid idiocy. As a priest, I have spent enough time on backward worlds to see the effects of an ancient genetic disorder variously called Down syndrome, Mongolism, or Generation Ship legacy. This, then, was the overall impression created by the 60 or so dark-robed little people who had approached me. I was being greeted by a silent, smiling band of bald, retarded children. I reminded myself that these were almost certainly the same group of smiling children who had slit Took's throat while he slept and left him to die like a butchered pig. The closest Bikura stepped forward, stopped 5 paces from me, and said something in a soft monotone. "Just a minute," I said, and fumbled out my comlog. I tapped in the translator function. "Betet ota min and loth crethim ket?" asked the short man in front of me. I slipped on the hear plug just in time to hear the comlog's translation. There was no lag time. The apparently foreign language was a simple corruption of archaic seed-ship English, not so far removed from the indigene argot of the plantations. "You are the man who belongs to the cross-shaped/cruciform," interpreted the comlog, giving me 2 choices for the final noun. "Yes," I said, knowing now that these were the ones who had touched me the night I slept through Took's murder, which meant that these were the ones who had murdered Took. I waited. The hunting mazer was in my pack. The pack was set against a small chalmer not 10 paces from me. Half a dozen Bikura stood between me and it. It did not matter. I knew at that instant that I would not use a weapon against another human being, even a human being who had murdered my guide and might well be planning to murder me at any second. I closed my eyes and said a silent act of contrition. When I opened my eyes, most of the Bikura had arrived. More of the Bikura had arrived. There was a cessation of movement, as if a quorum had been filled, a decision reached. "Yes," I said again into the silence. "I am the one who wears the cross." I heard the comlog speaker pronounce the last word, Cresfem. The Bikura nodded in unison, and, as if from a long practice as altar boys, all went to one knee, robes rustling softly, in perfect genuflection. I opened my mouth to speak, and found that I had nothing to say. I closed my mouth. The Bikura stood. A breeze moved the brittle chalmer fronds and leaves together to make a dry end-of-summer sound above us. The Bikura nearest me on the left stepped closer, grasped my forearm with a touch of cool, strong fingers, and spoke a soft sentence that my comlog translated as, "Come, it is time to go to the houses and sleep." It was mid-afternoon. Wondering if the comlog had translated the word sleep properly, or if it might be an idiom or metaphor for die, I nodded and followed them toward the village at the edge of the cleft. Now I sit in the hut and wait. There are rustling sounds. Someone else is awake now. I sit and wait. Day 97. The Bikura call themselves the 60 and 10. I've spent the past 26 hours talking to them, observing, making notes when they take their 2-hour mid-afternoon sleep, and generally trying to record as much data as I can before they decide to slit my throat. Except now I am beginning to believe that they will not hurt me. I spoke to them yesterday after our sleep. Sometimes they do not respond to questions, and when they do, the responses are little better than the grunts or divergent answers one receives from slow children. After their initial question and invitation at our first encounter, none of them originated a single query or comment my way. I questioned them subtly, carefully, cautiously, and with the professional calm of a trained ethnologist. I asked the simplest, most factual questions possible to make sure that the comlog was functioning properly. It was. But the sum total of the answers left me almost as ignorant as I had been 20-some hours before. Finally, tired in body and spirit, I abandoned professional subtlety and asked the group I was sitting with, "Did you kill my companion?" The 3 interlocutors did not look up from the weaving they were doing on a crude loom. "Yes," said the one I have come to think of as Alpha, because he had been the first to approach me in the forest. "We cut your companion's throat with sharpened stones, and held him down and silent while he struggled. He died the true death." "Why?" I asked after a moment. My voice sounded as dry as a corn husk crumbling. "Why did he die the true death?" said Alpha, not looking up. "Because all of his blood ran out, and he stopped breathing." "No," I said. "Why did you kill him?" Alpha did not respond, but Betty, who may or may not be female, and Alpha's mate, looked up from her loom and said simply, "To make him die." "Why?" The responses invariably came back, and just as invariably failed to enlighten me one iota. After much questioning, I had ascertained that they had killed Took to make him die, and that he had died because he had been killed. Shockingly, people do die when they are killed. "What is the difference between death and true death?" I asked, not trusting the comlog or my temper at this point. The third Bikura, Dell, grunted a response that the comlog interpreted as, "Your companion died a true death. You did not." Finally, in frustration far too close to rage, I snapped, "Why not? Why didn't you kill me?" All three stopped in the middle of their mindless weaving and looked at me. "You cannot be killed because you cannot die," said Alpha. "You cannot die because you belong to the cruciform and follow the way of the cross." I had no idea why the damn machine would translate cross as cross one second and as cruciform the next. Because you belong to the cruciform. A chill went through me, followed by the urge to laugh. Had I stumbled into that old adventure hollow cliché, the lost tribe that worshipped the god that had tumbled into their jungle until the poor bastard cuts himself shaving or something, and the tribe's people, assured and a bit relieved at the obvious mortality of their visitor, offer up their erstwhile deity as a sacrifice? It would have been funny if the image of Took's bloodless face and raw-rimmed gaping wound was not so fresh. Their reaction to the cross certainly suggested that I had encountered a group of survivors of a once Christian colony. Catholics? Even though the data in the comlog insisted that the dropship of 70 colonists who had crashed on this plateau 400 years ago had held only neo-Kerwin Marxists, all of whom should have been indifferent if not openly hostile to the old religions. I considered dropping the matter as being far too dangerous to pursue, but my stupid need to know drove me on. "Do you worship Jesus?" I asked. Their blank expressions left no need for a verbal negative. "Christ?" I tried again. "Jesus Christ? Christian? The Catholic Church?" No interest. "Catholic? Jesus? Mary? Saint Peter? Paul? Saint Teilhard?" The comlog made noises, but the words seemed to have no meaning for them. "You follow the cross?" I said, flailing for some last contact. All three looked at me. "We belong to the cruciform," said Alpha. I nodded, understanding nothing. This evening I fell asleep briefly just before sunset, and when I awoke it was to the organ pipe music of the cleft's nightfall winds. It was much louder here on the village ledges. Even the hovels seemed to join the chorus as the rising gusts whistled and whined through stone gaps, flapping fronds and crude smoke holes. Something was wrong. It took me a groggy minute to realize that the village was abandoned. Every hut was empty. I sat on a cold boulder and wondered if my presence had sparked some mass exodus. The wind music had ended, and meteors were beginning their nightly show through cracks in low clouds, when I heard a sound behind me, and turned to find all 70 of the 70 behind me. They walked past without a word and went to their huts. There were no lights. I imagined them sitting in their hovels, staring. I stayed outside for some time before returning to my own hut. After a while I walked to the edge of the grassy shelf and stood where rock dropped away into the abyss. A cluster of vines and roots clung to the cliff face, but appeared to end a few meters into space and hang there above emptiness. No vine could have been long enough to offer a way to the river 2 kilometers below. But the Bikura had come from this direction. Nothing made sense. I shook my head and went back to my hut. Sitting here, writing by the light of the comlog disk key, I try to think of precautions I can take to ensure that I will see the sunrise. I can think of none. I did mention that this was going to be a long one, and we are maybe halfway through. So, we're going to be here a while.
Y'alls are in for the long haul. But we're going places. Boy, howdy.
Day 103. The more I learn, the less I understand. I have moved most of my gear to the hut and they leave empty for me here in the village. I have taken photographs, recorded video and audio chips, and imaged a full holoscan of the village and its inhabitants. They do not seem to care. I project their images and they walk right through them, showing no interest. I play back their words to them, and they smile and go back to their hovels to sit for hours, doing nothing, saying nothing. I offer them trade trinkets, and they take them without comment, check to see if they are edible, and then leave them lying. The grass is littered with plastic beads, mirrors, bits of coloured cloth, and cheap pens. I have set up the full medical lab, but to no avail. The 70 will not let me examine them, will not let me take blood samples, even though I have repeatedly shown them that it is painless, will not even let me scan them with the diagnostic equipment. Will not, in short, cooperate in any way. They do not argue. They do not explain. They simply turn away and go about their non-business. After a week, I still cannot tell the males from the females. Their faces remind me of those visual puzzles that shift forms as you stare. Sometimes Betty's face looks undeniably female, and 10 seconds later the sense of gender is gone, and I think of her, him, as Beta again. Their voices undergo the same shift. Soft, well-modulated, sexless. They remind me of the poorly programmed home comps one encounters on backward worlds. I find myself hoping to catch a glimpse of a naked Bikura. This is not easy for a Jesuit of 48 standard years to admit. Still, it would not be an easy task even for a veteran voyeur. The nudity taboo seems absolute. They wear the long robes while awake and during their 2-hour midday nap. They leave the village area to urinate and defecate, and I suspect they do not remove the loose robes even then. They do not seem to bathe. One would suspect that this would cause olfactory problems, but there is no odour about these primitives except for the slight sweet smell of chalma. "You must undress sometimes," I said to Alpha one day, abandoning delicacy in favour of information. "No," said Al, and went elsewhere to sit and do nothing while fully dressed. They have no names. I found this incredible at first, but now I am sure.
"We are all that was and will be," said the shortest Bikura,
One I think of as female and call Epi.
"We are the 70.
I searched the comlog records and confirmed what I suspected. In more than 16,000 known human societies, none are listed where there are no individual names at all. Even in the loosest hive societies, individuals respond to their class category followed by a simple code. I tell them my name and they stare. "Father Paul Duret! Father Paul Duret!" repeats the comlog translator, but there is no attempt at even simple repetition. Except for their mass disappearances each day before sunset and their common 2-hour sleep time, they do very little as a group. Even their lodging arrangements appear random. Al will spend one nap time with Betty, the next with Gam, and the third with Zelda or Pete. No system or schedule is apparent. Every third day the entire group of 70 goes into the forests to forage, and returns with berries, chalma roots and bark, fruit, and whatever else might be edible. I was sure they were vegetarians until I saw Dell munching on the cold corpse of an infant arboreal. The little primate must have fallen from the high branches. It seems, then, that the 70 do not disdain meat, they simply are too stupid to hunt and kill it. When the Bikura are thirsty, they walk almost 300 meters to a stream that cascades into the cleft. In spite of this inconvenience, there are no signs of water skins, jugs, or any type of pottery. I keep my reserve of water in 10-gallon plastic containers, but the villagers take no notice. In my plummeting respect for these people, I do not find it unlikely that they have spent generations in a village with no handy water source. "Who built the houses?" I ask. They have no word for village.
The 3 score and 10, responds Will.
I can tell him from the others only by a broken finger that did not mend well. Each of them has at least one such distinguishing feature, although sometimes I think it would be easier to tell crows apart. When did they build them? I ask, although I should know by now that any question that starts with when will not receive an answer. I receive no answer. They go into the cleft each evening, down the vines. On the third evening I tried to observe this exodus, but 6 of them turned me back from the edge, and gently but persistently brought me back to my hut. It was the first observable action of the Bikura that had hinted at aggression, and I sat in some apprehension after they had gone. The next evening, as they departed, I went quietly to my hut, not even peering out, but after they returned I retrieved the imager and its tripod from where I had left them near the edge. The timer had worked perfectly. The hollows showed the Bikura grabbing the vines and scrambling down the cliff face as nimbly as the little arboreals that fill the Chalmer and Weirwood forests. Then they disappeared under the overhang. "What do you do when you go down the cliff each evening?" I asked Owl the next day. The native looked at me with the seraphic Buddha smile I have learned to hate.
You belong to the cruciform, he said, that as if that answered everything.
"Do you worship when you go down the cliff?" I asked.
No answer.
I thought a minute. "I also follow the cross," I said, knowing that it would be translated as belong to the cruciform. Any day now I will not need the translator program. But this conversation was too important to leave to chance. "Does this mean that I should join you when you go down the cliff face?" For a second I thought that Owl was thinking. His brow furrowed, and I realized that it was the first time I had seen one of the 3 score and 10 come close to frowning. Then he said,
You cannot. You belong to the cruciform, but you are not of the 3 score and 10.
I realized that it had taken every neuron and synapse in his brain to frame that distinction. "What would you do if I did go down the cliff face?" I asked, expecting no response. Hypothetical questions almost always had as much luck as my time-based queries. This time he did respond. The seraphic smile and untroubled countenance returned, and Alpha said softly,
If you try to go down the cliff, we will hold you down on the grass, take sharpened stones, cut your throat, and wait until your blood stops flowing and your heart stops beating.
I said nothing. I wondered if he could hear the pounding of my heart at that moment. Well, I thought, at least you don't have to worry any longer that they think you are a god. The silence stretched. Finally, Al added one more sentence that I've been thinking about ever since.
And if you did it again, he said, we would have to kill you again.
We stared at each other for some time after that, each convinced, I am sure, that the other was a total idiot. Day 104. Each new revelation adds to my confusion. The absence of children here has bothered me since my first day in the village. Looking back through my notes, I find frequent mention of it in the daily observations I have dictated to my comlog, but no record of it in the personal mishmash here that I call a journal. Perhaps the implications of it were too frightening. To my frequent and clumsy attempts at piercing this mystery, the 3 score and 10 have offered their usual enlightenment. The person questioned smiles beatifically, and responds with some non sequitur that would make the babble of the web's worst village idiot seem like sage aphorisms in comparison. More often than not, they do not answer at all. One day I stood in front of the one I have tagged as Dell, stayed there until he had to acknowledge my presence, and asked, "Why are there no children?"
We are the 70, he said softly.
Where are the babies?
No response. No sense of evading the question, merely a blank stare. I took a breath.
Who is the youngest among you?
Dell appeared to be thinking, wrestling with the concept. He was overmatched. I wondered if the Bikura had lost their time sense so completely that any such question was doomed. After a minute of silence, however, Dell pointed to where Al was crouched in the sunlight, working with his crude hand loom, and said,
There is the last one to return. To return? I said. From where?
Dell stared at me with no emotion, not even impatience.
You belong to the cruciform, he said. You must know the way of the cross.
I nodded. I knew enough to recognize that in this direction lay one of the many conversational illogic loops that usually derailed our dialogues. I hunted for some way to keep a grasp of the thin thread of information.
Then Al, I said and pointed, is the last to be born, to return, but others will return.
I was not sure that I understood my own question. How does one inquire about birth when the interviewee has no word for child and no concept of time? But Dell seemed to understand. He nodded.
Encouraged, I asked, Then when will the next of the 70 be born? Return. No one can return until one dies, he said.
Suddenly I thought I understood.
So no new children, no one will be returned until someone dies, I said. You replace the missing one with another to keep the group at 70.
Dell responded with a type of silence I had come to interpret as assent. The pattern seemed clear enough. The Bikura were quite serious about their 70. They kept the tribal population at 70, the same number recorded on the passenger list of the dropship that crashed here 400 years ago. Little chance of coincidence there. When someone died, they allowed a child to be born to replace the adult. Simple. Simple, but impossible. Nature and biology do not work that neatly. Besides the problem of minimum herd population, there were other absurdities. Even though it is difficult to tell the ages of these smooth-skinned people, it is obvious that no more than 10 years separates the oldest from the youngest. Although they act like children, I would guess their average age to be in the late 30s or mid-40s in standard years. So where are the very old? Where are the parents, aging uncles, and unmarried aunts? At this rate, the entire tribe will enter old age at approximately the same time. What happens when they all pass beyond childbearing age and it comes time to replace members of the tribe? The Bikura lead dull, sedentary lives. The accident rate, even while living on the very edge of the cleft, must be low. There are no predators. The seasonal variations are minimal, and the food supply almost certainly remains stable. But, granted all this, there must have been times in the 400-year history of this baffling group when disease swept the village, when more than the usual number of vines gave way and dropped citizens into the cleft, or when something caused that abnormal cluster of sudden deaths that insurance companies have dreaded since time immemorial. And then what? Do they breed to make up the difference and then revert to their current sexless behavior? Are the Bikura so different from every other recorded human society that they have a rutting period once every few years? Once a decade? Once in a lifetime? It is doubtful. I sit here in my hut and review the possibilities. One is that these people live very long lifetimes, and can reproduce during most of that time, allowing for simple replacement of tribal casualties. Only this does not explain their common ages, and there is no mechanism to explain any such longevity.
The best anti-aging drugs the hegemony has to offer only manage to extend an active lifetime a bit over the 100 standard year mark. Preventative health measures have spread the vitality of early middle age well into the late 60s, my age, but except for clonal transplants, bioengineering, and other perks for the very rich, no one in the world web can expect to begin planning a family when they are 70, or expect to dance at their 110th birthday party. If eating chalma roots or breathing the pure air of the Pinion Plateau had a dramatic effect on retarding aging, it would be a sure bet that everyone on Hyperion would be living here munching chalma, that this planet would have had a Farcaster centuries ago, and that every citizen of the hegemony who has a universal card would be planning to spend vacations and retirement here. No, a more logical conclusion is that the Bikura live normal-length lives, have children at a normal rate, but kill them unless a replacement is required. They may practice abstinence or birth control, other than slaughtering the newborn, until the entire band reaches an age where new blood will soon be needed. A mass birthing time explains the apparent common age of the members of the tribe. But who teaches the young? What happens to the parents and other older people? Do the Bikura pass along the rudiments of their crude excuse for a culture and then allow their own deaths? Would this be a true death? The rubbing out of an entire generation? Do the 70 murder individuals at both ends of the bell-shaped age curve? This type of speculation is useless. I am beginning to get furious at my own lack of problem-solving skills. Let's form a strategy here and act on it, Paul. Get off your lazy Jesuit ass. Problem: how to tell the sexes apart. Solution: cajole or coerce a few of these poor devils into a medical exam. Find out what all the sex role mystery and nudity taboo is about. A society that depends upon years of rigid sexual abstinence for population control is consistent with my new theory. Problem: why are they so fanatical about maintaining the same 70 population that the lost dropship colonies started with? Solution: keep pestering them until you find out. Problem: where are the children? Solution: keep pressing and poking until you find out. Perhaps the evening excursion down the cliff is related to all this. There may be a nursery there, or a pile of small bones. Problem: what is this belong to the cruciform and way of the cross business, if not a contorted vestige of the original colonists' religious beliefs? Solution: find out by going to the source. Could their daily descent down the cliff be religious in nature? Problem: what is down the cliff face? Solution: go down and see. Tomorrow, if their pattern holds true, all 70 of the 70 will wander into the woods for several hours of foraging. This time I will not go with them. This time I am going over the edge and down the cliff.
Day 105. 0930 hours.
Thank you, O Lord, for allowing me to see what I have seen today. Thank you, O Lord, for bringing me to this place at this time to see the proof of your presence. 11:25 hours. Edward! Edward! I have to return, to show you all, to show everyone. I've packed everything I need, putting the imager discs and film in a pouch I wove from Bestos leaves. I have food, water, the mazer with its weakening charge, tent, sleep robes. If only the arrestor rods had not been stolen. The Bikura might have kept them. No, I've searched the hovels in the nearby forest. They would have no use for them. It doesn't matter. I'll leave today if I can, otherwise as soon as I can. Edward, I have it all here on the film and discs. 1400. There is no way through the flame forests today. The smoke drove me back even before I penetrated the edge of the active zone. I returned to the village and went over the hollows. There is no mistake. The miracle is real. 15:30 hours. The 70 will return any moment. What if they know? What if they can tell by looking at me that I have been there? I could hide. No, there is no need to hide. God did not bring me this far and let me see what I have seen, only to let me die at the hands of these poor children. 16:15 hours. The 70 returned and went to their huts without giving me a glance. I sit here in the doorway of my own hut, and cannot keep from smiling, from laughing, and from praying. Earlier I walked to the edge of the cleft, said Mass, and took communion. The villagers did not bother to watch. How soon can I leave? Supervisor Orlandi and Took said that the flame forest was active for 3 local months, 120 days, then relatively quiet for 2. Took and I arrived here on day 87. I cannot wait. I cannot wait another 100 days to bring the news to the world, to all of the worlds. If only a skimmer would brave the weather and flame forests and pluck me out of here. If only I could access one of the datafix sats that serve the plantations. Anything is possible. More miracles will occur. 2350 hours. The 70 have gone down into the cleft. The voices of the evening wind choir are rising all around. How I wish I could be with them now, there, below. I will do the next best thing. I will drop to my knees here near the cliff edge and pray while the organ notes of the planet and sky sing what I now know is a hymn to a real and present God. Day 106. I awoke today to a perfect morning. The sky was a deep turquoise. The sun was a sharp, blood-red stone set within. I stood outside my hut as the mists cleared, the arboreals ended their morning screech concert, and the air began to warm. Then I went in and viewed my tapes and discs. I realized that in yesterday's excited scribblings I mentioned nothing of what I found down the cliff. I will do so now. I have the discs, film tapes, and comlog notes, but there is always the chance that only these personal journals will be found. I lowered myself over the cliff edge at approximately 0730 hours yesterday morning. The Bikura were all foraging in the forest. The descent on vines had looked simple enough. They were bound around one another sufficiently to create a sort of ladder in most places. But as I swung out and began to let myself down, I could feel my heart pounding hard enough to be painful. There was a sheer 3,000-meter drop to the rocks and river below. I kept a tight grip on at least 2 vines at all times, and centimetered my way down, trying not to look at the abyss beneath my feet. It took me the better part of an hour to descend the 150 meters that I am sure the Bikura can cover in 10 minutes. Eventually I reached the curve of an overhang. Some vines trailed away into space, but most of them curled under the sheer slab of rock toward the cliff wall 30 meters in. Here and there the vines appeared to have been braided to form crude bridges, upon which the Bikura probably walked with little or no help from their hands. I crawled along these braided strands, clutching other vines for support, and uttering prayers I had not said since my boyhood. I stared straight ahead as if I could forget that there was only a seemingly infinite expanse of air under those swaying, creaking strands of vegetable matter. There was a broad ledge along the cliff wall. I allowed 3 meters of it to separate me from the gulf before I squeezed through the vines and dropped 2.5 meters to the stone. The ledge was about 5 meters wide, and it terminated a short distance to the northeast, where the great mass of the overhang began. I followed a path along the ledge to the southwest, and had gone 20 or 30 paces before I stopped in shock. It was a path. A path worn out of solid stone. Its shiny surface had been pushed centimeters below the level of the surrounding rock. Further on, where the path descended to the curving lip of a ledge to a lower, wider level, steps had been cut into the stone, but even these had been worn to the point that they seemed to sag in the middle. I sat down for a second as the impact of this simple fact struck me. Even 4 centuries of daily travel by the 70 could not account for such erosion of solid rock. Someone or something had used this path long before the Bikura colonists crashed here. Someone or something had used this path for millennia. I stood and walked on. There was little noise except for the wind blowing gently along the half-kilometre wide cleft. I realized that I could hear the soft sound of the river far below. The path curved left around a section of cliff and ended. I stepped out onto a broad apron of gently descending stone and stared. I believe I made the sign of the cross without thinking. Because this ledge ran due north and south for a 100-meter cut of cliff, I could look due west along a 30-kilometer slash of cleft to open sky where the plateau ended. I realized at once that the setting sun would illuminate this slab of cliff wall under the overhang each evening. It would not have surprised me if, on the spring or autumn solstice, Hyperion's sun would, from this vantage point, appear to set directly into the cleft, its red sides just touching the pink-toned rock walls. I turned left and stared at the cliff face. The worn path led across the wide ledge to doors carved in the vertical slab of stone. No, these were not merely doors, they were portals, intricately carved portals, with elaborate stone casements and lintels. To either side of these twin doors spread broad windows of stained glass, rising at least 20 meters toward the overhang. I went closer and inspected the facade. Whoever had built this had done so by widening the area under the overhang, slicing a sheer, smooth wall into the granite of the plateau, and then tunneling directly into the cliff face. I ran my hand over the deeply cut folds of ornamental carving around the door. Smooth. Everything had been smoothed and worn and softened by time, even here, hidden away from most of the elements by the protective lip of the overhang. How many thousands of years had this temple been carved into the south wall of the cleft? The stained glass was neither glass nor plastic, but some thick, translucent substance that seemed as hard as the surrounding stone to the touch. Nor was the window a composite of panels. The colors swirled, shaded, melded, and blended into one another like oil on water. I removed my flashlight from the pack, touched one of the doors, and hesitated as the tall portal swung inward with frictionless ease. I entered the vestibule, there is no other word for it, crossed the silent 10-meter space, and paused in front of another wall made from the same stained glass material that even now glowed behind me, filling the vestibule with the thick light of 100 subtle hues. I realized instantly that at the sunset hour, the direct rays of the sun would fill this room with incredibly deep shafts of color, would strike the stained glass wall in front of me, and would illuminate whatever lay beyond. I found the single door, outlined by thin, dark metal set into the stained glass stone, and I passed through it. On Pachem we have, as best as we could from ancient photos and hollows, rebuilt the Basilica of St. Peter's exactly as it stood in the ancient Vatican. Almost 700 feet long and 450 feet wide, the church can hold 50,000 worshippers when His Holiness says Mass. We have never had more than 5,000 faithful there, even when the Council of Bishops of all the worlds is in assembly every 43 years. In the central apse, near our copy of Bernini's Throne of St. Peter, The great dome rises more than 130 meters above the floor of the altar. It is an impressive space. This space was larger. In the dim light, I used the beams of my flashlight to ascertain that I was in a single great room, a giant hall hollowed out of solid stone. I estimated that the smooth walls rose to a ceiling that must be only a few meters beneath the surface of the crag where the Bikura had set their huts. There was no ornamentation here, no furniture, no sign of any concession to form or function, except for the object that sat squarely in the center of this huge echoing cave of a room. Centered in the great hall was an altar, a 5-meter square slab of stone, where the rest of stone left when the rest was hollowed out. Let's try that sentence again. I'm sorry. Centered in the great hall was an altar, a 5-meter square slab of stone left when the rest was hollowed out. And from this altar rose a cross. 4 meters high, 3 meters wide, carved in the old style of the elaborate crucifixes of old Earth, the cross faced the stained glass wall as if awaiting the sun and the explosion of light that would ignite the inlaid diamonds, sapphires, blood crystals, lapis beads, queen's tears, onyxes, and other precious stones that I could make out in the light of the flashlight as I approached. I knelt and prayed. Shutting off the flashlight, I waited several minutes before my eyes could discern the cross in the dim, smoky light. This was, without a doubt, the cruciform of which the Bikura spoke. And it had been set here a minimum of many thousands of years ago, perhaps tens of thousands, long before mankind first left old Earth, almost certainly before Christ taught in Galilee. I prayed. Today I sit out in the sunlight after reviewing the hollow discs. I have confirmed what I barely noticed during my return up the cliff after discovering what I now think of as the basilica. On the ledge outside the basilica there are steps descending farther into the cleft. Although not as worn as the path leading to the basilica, they are equally intriguing. God alone knows what other wonders wait below. I must let the world know of this find. The irony of my being the one to discover this is not lost on me. If it had not been for Armagast and my exile, this discovery might have waited more centuries. The Church might have died before this revelation could have brought new life to it. But I have found it. One way or the other, I will leave or get my message out. Day 107. I am a prisoner. This morning I was bathing in my usual place, near where the stream drops over the cliff edge, when I heard a sound and looked up to see the Bikura I called Dell staring at me with wide eyes. I called a greeting, but the little Bikura turned and ran. It was perplexing. They rarely hurry. Then I realized that even though I had been wearing trousers at the time, I had undoubtedly violated their nudity taboo by allowing Dell to see me naked from the waist up. I smiled, shook my head, finished dressing, and returned to the village. If I had known what awaited me there, I would not have been amused. The entire 70 stood watching as I approached. I stopped a dozen paces from Al. "Good afternoon," I said. Al pointed, and half a dozen of the Bikura lunged toward me, seized my arms and legs, and pinned me to the ground. Beta stepped forward and removed a sharp-edged stone from his or her robes. As I struggled in vain to pull free, Beta cut my clothes down the front and pulled apart the shreds until I was all but naked. I ceased struggling as the mob pressed forward. They stared at my pale, white body and murmured to themselves. I could feel my heart pounding. "I am sorry if I have offended your laws," I began, "but there is no reason—" "Silence!" said Alpha, and spoke to the tall Bikura with the scar on his palm, the one I called Zed. "He is not of the cruciform." Zed nodded. "Let me explain," I began again, but Alpha silenced me with a backhanded slap that left my lip bleeding and my ears ringing. There had been no more sense of hostility in his action than I would have shown in silencing a comlog by throwing a switch. "What are we to do with him?" asked Alpha.
Those who do not follow the cross must die the true death,
said Beta, and the crowd shifted forward. Many had sharpened stones in their hands.
Those not of the cruciform must die the true death,
said Beta, and her voice held the tones of complacent finality common to oft-repeated formulae and religious litanies. "I follow the cross!" I cried out as the crowd tugged me to my feet. I grabbed at the crucifix that hung round my neck and struggled against the pressure of many arms. Finally, I managed to lift the little cross over my head. Alpha held up his hand, and the crowd paused. In the sudden silence, I could hear the river 3 kilometers below in the cleft. "He does carry a cross," said Alpha. Dell pressed forward.
"But he is not of the cruciform. I saw. It is not as we thought. He is not of the cruciform."
There was murder in his voice. I cursed myself for being careless and stupid. The future of the church depended upon my survival, and I had thrown both away by beguiling myself into believing that the Bikura were dull, harmless children.
Those who do not follow the cross must die the true death,
repeated Beta. It was a final sentencing. Stones were being raised by 70 hands when I shouted, knowing that it was either my last chance or my final condemnation. "I have been down the cliff and worshipped at your altar. I follow the cross." Alpha and the mob hesitated. I could see that they were wrestling with this new thought. It was not easy for them. "I follow the cross and wish to be of the cruciform," I said as calmly as I could. "I have been to your altar." "Those who do not follow the cross must die the true death," called Gamma.
But he follows the cross, said Alpha. He hath prayed in the room.
"This cannot be," said Zed. "The 70 pray there, and he is not of the 70.
"We knew before this that he is not of the 70, said Alpha, frowning slightly as he dealt with the concept of past tense.
"He is not of the cruciform," said Delta 2.
"Those who are not of the cruciform must die the true death," said Beta.
"He follows the cross," said Alpha. "Can he not then become of the cruciform?"
An outcry arose. In the general babble and shuffle of forms, I pulled against restraining hands, but their grips remained firm.
"He is not of the 70, and is not of the cruciform," said Beta, sounding
more puzzled than hostile now.
"How is it then that he should not die the true death? We must take the stones and open his throat so that the blood flows until his heart stops. He is not of the cruciform."
"He follows the cross," said Alpha. "Can he not become of the cruciform?"
This time silence followed the question.
"He follows the cross and has prayed at the room of the cruciform," said Alpha. "He must not die the true death."
"All die the true death," said a Bikura whom I did not recognize.
My arms were sorry. My arms were aching from the strain of holding the crucifix above my head.
Except the 70, finished the anonymous Bikura. Because they followed the cross, prayed at the room, and became of the cruciform, said Alpha, must he not then become of the cruciform?
I stood there, gripping the cold metal of the small cross, and awaited their verdict. I was afraid to die. I felt afraid. But the larger part of my mind seemed almost detached. My greatest regret was that I would not be able to send out the news of the Basilica to an unbelieving universe.
Come, we will talk of this,
Beta said to the group, and they pulled me with them as they trod silently back to the village. They have imprisoned me here in my hut. There was no chance to try for the hunting mazer. Several of them held me down while they emptied the hut of most of my possessions. They took my clothing, leaving me only one of their rough-woven robes to cover myself with. The longer I sit here, the more angry and anxious I become. They have taken my comlog, imager, discs, chips, everything. I have a single unopened crate of medical diagnostic equipment left up at the old site, but that cannot help me document the miracle of the cleft. If they destroy the things they have taken, and then destroy me, there will be no record of the Basilica. If I had a weapon, I could kill the guards and... Oh, dear God, what am I thinking? Edward, what am I to do? And even if I survive this, make my way back to Keats, arrange travel back to the web, who would believe me? After 9 years' absence from Pachem because of the quantum leap time debt, just an old man returning with the same lies he was exiled for. Oh, dear God, if they destroy the data, let them destroy me as well. After 3 days, day 110, after 3 days they have decided my fate. Zed and the one I think of as Theta Prime came to get me shortly after midday. I blinked as they led me out into the light. The 70 stood in a wide semicircle near the cliff edge. I fully expected to be thrown over that edge. Then I noticed the bonfire. I had assumed that the Bakura was so primitive that they had lost the art of making and using fire. They did not warm themselves with fire, and their huts were always dark. I had never seen them cook a meal, not even the rare corpse of an arboreal they devoured. But now the fire was burning strongly, and they were the only ones who could have started it. I looked to see what fueled the flames. They were burning my clothes, my comlog, my field notes, the tape cassettes, the video chips, data disks, the imager, everything that had held information. I screamed at them, tried to throw myself at the fire, and called them names I had not used since the street days of my childhood. They ignored me. Finally, Alpha came close. "You will become of the cruciform," he said softly. I did not care. They led me back to my hut, where I wept for an hour. There is no guard at the door. A minute ago I stood at the doorway and considered running for the flame forests. Then I thought of a much shorter but no less fatal run to the cleft. I did nothing. The sun will be setting in a short time. Already the winds are rising. Soon, soon. Day 112. Has it been only 2 days? It has been for... Of course, someone's calling me now. Give me a sec. Okay, this is important. Just give me a minute. I'll be right back. Sorry about that. We are back. Somewhat important. Someone I needed to talk to earlier in the day, but they decided not to call me until now when I said I wasn't free to talk. But here we are. Day 112. Has it been only 2 days? It has been forever. It did not come off this morning. It did not come off. The med scanner's image wafer is right here in front of me, but I still cannot believe it. And yet I'm due. I am of the cruciform now. They came for me just before sunset. All of them. I did not struggle as they led me to the edge of the cleft. They were more agile on the vines than I could have imagined. I slowed them down, but they were patient, showing me the easiest footholds, the fastest route. Hyperion's sun had dropped below low clouds and was visible above the rim wall to the west as we walked the final few meters to the basilica. The evening wind song was louder than I had anticipated. And I lost my track. Oh no. The evening wind song was louder than I had anticipated. It was as if we were caught amid the pipes of a gigantic church organ. The notes rose from bass growls so deep that my bones and teeth resonated in sympathy, to high, piercing screams that slid easily into the ultrasonic. Alpha opened the outer doors, and we passed through the antechamber into the central basilica. The 70 made a wide circle around the altar and its tall cross. There was no litany. There was no singing. There was no ceremony. We simply stood there in silence as the wind roared through the fluted columns outside and echoed in the great empty room carved into the stone, echoed and resonated and grew in volume until I clapped my hands over my ears. And all the while the streaming horizontal rays of sunlight filled the hall with deepening hues of amber, gold, lapis, and then amber again, colors so deep that they made the air thick with light and lay like paint against the skin. I watched as the cross caught this light and held it in each of its 1,000 precious stones, held it, it seemed, even after the sun had set and the windows had faded into a twilight grey. It was as if the great crucifix had absorbed the light and was radiating it toward us, into us. And then even the cross was dark, and the winds died, and in the sudden dimness Alpha said softly, "Brig hib along." We emerged onto the wide ledge of stone, and Beta was there with torches. As Beta passed them out to a selected few, I wondered if the Bikura reserved fire for ritual purposes only. Then Beta was leading the way, and we descended the narrow staircase carved into the stone. At first I crept along, terrified, clutching at the smooth rock and searching for any reassuring projection of root or stone. The drop to our right was so sheer and endless that it bordered on being absurd. Descending the ancient staircase was far worse than clutching at vines on the cliff face above. Here I had to look down each time I placed a foot on the narrow, age-slickened slabs. A slip and fall at first seemed probable, then inevitable. I had the urge to stop then, to return at least to the safety of the basilica, but most of the 70 were behind me on the narrow staircase, and there seemed little chance that they would stand aside to let me pass. Besides this, and even greater than my fear, was the nagging curiosity about what was at the bottom of the staircase. I did pause long enough to glance up at the lip of the cleft 300 meters above, and to see that the clouds were gone, the stars were out, and the nightly ballet of meteor trails was bright against a sable sky. Then I lowered my head, began a whispered recitation of the rosary, and followed the torchlight and the Bikura into the treacherous depths. I could not believe that the staircase would take us all the way to the bottom of the cleft, but it did.
When, some time after midnight, I realized that we would be descending all the way down to the next level of the river, I estimated that it would take us until noon of the next day, but it did not. We reached the base of the cleft shortly before sunrise. The stars still shone in the aperture of sky between cliff walls that rose an impossible distance on either side. Exhausted, staggering downwards step by step, recognizing slowly that there were no more steps, I stared upward and wondered stupidly if the stars remained visible there in the daylight, as they did in a well I had lowered myself into once as a child in Villefranche-sur-Saône. "Here," said Beta. It was the first word uttered in many hours, and was barely audible over the roar of the river. The 70 stopped where they were and stood motionless. Ah, geez, there we go again.
I am loved. So, if you're wondering what happens when you're one of the people who has to keep an eye on certain systems of a functioning building after there's been a major flood event, a building that has multiple people living in it at any given time, and because the people who actually own the property refuse to have an actual proper building manager who's there 24/7 to actually handle this stuff, they communicate with you because you happen to know how the network works, even though that has no bearing on how the elevator works, which incidentally is a whole other can of worms that I'm not going to go into on stream because there's really nothing to be gained from it. At any rate, now I have to find where I was before I got there. Where were we? There's no possibility that I could climb the stairway we had just descended. No. Actually, that might be it. We'll take that paragraph from the top. There's a page break, and I think it was close to the page start, but it's not long. "Here," said Beta. It was the first word uttered in many hours, and was barely audible over the roar of the river. The 70 stopped where they were and stood motionless. I collapsed to my knees and fell on my side. There was no possibility that I could climb that stairway we had just descended. Not in a day, not in a week, perhaps never. I closed my eyes to sleep, but the dull fuel of nervous tension continued to burn inside me. I looked out across the floor of the ravine. The river here was wider than I had The river here was wider than I had anticipated, at least 70 meters across, and the noise of it was beyond mere noise. I felt that I was being consumed by a great beast's roar. I sat up and stared at a patch of darkness in the opposing cliff wall. It was a shadow darker than the shadows. How do I keep doing this? Why do I keep losing my place? It was a shadow darker than the shadows, more regular than the serrated patchwork of buttresses and crevices and columns that mottled the face of the cliff. It was a perfect square of darkness, at least 30 meters to a side.
A door or hole in the cliff wall. A door or hole in the cliff wall. I struggled to my feet and looked downriver along the wall we had just descended. Yes, it was there. The other entrance, the one toward which Beta and the others even now were walking, was faintly visible in the starlight. I had found an entrance to Hyperion's labyrinth.
Did you know that Hyperion was one of the 9 labyrinthine worlds?
Someone had asked me on the dropship. Yes, it was the young priest named Hoyt. I had said yes and dismissed the fact. I was interested in the Bikura, actually more in the self-inflicted pain of my own exile, not the labyrinths or their builders. 9 worlds have labyrinths. 9 out of 176 web worlds, and another 200-some colonial and protectorate planets. 9 worlds out of 9 worlds out of 8,000 or more worlds explored, however cursorially, since the Hegira. There are planetary archaeohistorians who devote their lives to the study of the labyrinths. Not I. I had always found them a sterile topic, vaguely unreal. Now I walked toward one with the 70, as the Cannes River roared and vibrated and threatened to douse our torches with its spray. The labyrinths were dug, tunneled, created more than 750,000 standard years ago. The details were inevitably the same, their origins inevitably unsolved. Labyrinthine worlds are always Earth-like, at least to 7.9 on the Solmev scale, always circling a G-type star, and yet always restricted to worlds that are tectonically dead, more like Mars than old Earth. The tunnels themselves are set deep, usually a minimum of 10 kilometers, but often as deep as 30, and they catacomb the crust of the planet. On Svoboda, not far from Pachem's system, over 800,000 kilometers of labyrinth have been explored by remotes. The tunnels on each world are 30 meters square and carved by some technology still not available to the hegemony. I read once in an archaeological journal that Kemp, Holzer, and Weinstein had postulated a fusion tunneler that would explain the perfectly smooth walls and lack of tailings, but their theory did not explain where the builders or their machines had come from, or why they had devoted centuries to such an apparently aimless engineering task. Each of the labyrinthine worlds, including Hyperion, had been probed and researched. Nothing has ever been found. No signs of excavation machinery, no rusting miners' helmets, not a single piece of shattered plastic or decomposing stim stick wrapper. Researchers have not even identified entrance and exit shafts. No suggestion of heavy metals or precious ores has been sufficient to explain such a monumental effort. No legend or artifact of the labyrinth builders has survived. The mystery has mildly intrigued me over the years, but never concerned me. Until now. We entered the tunnel mouth. It was not a perfect square. Erosion and gravity had turned the perfect tunnel into a rough cave for 100 meters into the cliff wall. Beta stopped just where the tunnel floor grew smooth and extinguished his torch. The other Bikura did likewise. It was very dark. The tunnel had turned enough the tunnel had turned enough to block out any starlight that might have entered. I had been in caves before. With the torches extinguished, I did not expect my eyes to adapt to the near-total darkness. But they did. Within 30 seconds I began to sense a roseate glow, dim at first, then ever richer as the cave was brighter than the canyon, until the cave was brighter than the canyon had been, brighter than Pachem under the glow of its triune moons. The light came from 100 sources, 1,000 sources. I was able to make out the nature of these sources just as the Bikura dropped reverently to their knees.
The cave walls and ceiling were encrusted with crosses, ranging in size from a few millimeters to almost a meter long. Each glowed with a deep pink light of its own. Invisible in the torchlight, these glowing crosses now suffused the tunnel with light. I approached one embedded in the wall nearest me. 30 or so centimeters across, it pulsed with a soft, organic glow. This was not something that had been carved out of stone or attached to the wall. It was definitely organic, definitely alive, resembling soft coral. It was slightly warm to the touch. There came the slightest whisper of sound. No, not sound. A disturbance in the cool air, perhaps, and I turned in time to see something enter the chamber. The Bikura were still kneeling, their heads down, eyes lowered. I remained standing. My gaze never left the thing which moved among the kneeling Bikura. It was vaguely man-shaped, but in no way human. It stood at least 3 meters tall. Even when it was at rest, the silvered surface of the thing seemed to shift and flow like mercury suspended in mid-air. The reddish glow from the crosses set into the tunnel walls reflected from sharp surfaces and glinted on the curved metal blades protruding from the thing's forehead, 4 wrists, oddly jointed elbows, knees, armored back, and thorax. It flowed between the kneeling Bikura, and when it extended 4 long arms, hands extended but fingers clicking into place like chrome scalpels, I was absurdly reminded of His Holiness on Pachem offering a benediction to the faithful. I had no doubt that I was looking at the legendary Shrike. At that moment I must have moved or made a sound, for large red eyes turned my way, and I found myself hypnotized by the dance of light within the multifaceted prisms there. Not merely reflected light, but a fierce, blood-bright glow, which seemed to burn within the creature's barbed skull, and pulse in the terrible gems set where God meant eyes to be. When it moved, or rather, it did not move, but ceased being there, and was here, leaning less than a meter from me, its oddly jointed arms encircling me in a fence of body blades and liquid silver steel. Panting hard, but unable to take a breath, I saw my own reflection, face white and distorted, dancing across the surface of the thing's metallic shell and burning eyes. I confess that I felt something closer to exaltation than fear. Something inexplicable was happening. Forged in Jesuit logic and tempered in the cold bath of science, I nevertheless understood at that second the ancient obsession of the God-fearing for another kind of fear. The thrill of exorcism, the mindless whirl of dervish possession, the puppet dance ritual of tarot, and the almost erotic surrender of seance, speaking in tongues, and Zen Gnostic trance. I realized at that instant just how surely the just how surely the affirmation of demons or the summoning of Satan somehow can affirm the reality of their mystic antithesis, the God of Abraham. Thinking none of this, but feeling all of it, I awaited the embrace of the Shrike with the imperceptible tremble of a virgin bride. It disappeared. There was no thunderclap, no sudden smell of brimstone, not even a scientifically sound inrush of air. 1 second the thing was there, surrounding me with its beautiful certainty of sharp-edged death, and the next instant it was gone. Numbed, I stood there and blinked as Alpha rose and approached. Alpha rose and approached me in the Bosch-tinted gloom. He stood where the Shrike had stood, his own arms extended in a pathetic imitation of the deadly perfection I had just witnessed. but there was no sign on Alpha's bland Bikura face that he had seen the creature. He made an awkward, open-handed gesture which seemed to indicate the labyrinth, cave wall, and scores of glowing crosses embedded there. "Cruciform," said Alpha. The 10 rose, came closer, and knelt again. I looked at their placid faces in the soft light, and I also knelt. You will follow the cross all of your days," said Alpha, and his voice carried the cadence of litany. The rest of the Bikura repeated the statement in a tone just short of a chant. "You will be of the cruciform all of your days," said Alpha, and as the others repeated this, he reached out and pulled a small cruciform away from the cave wall. It was not more than a dozen centimeters long, and it came away from the wall with the faintest of snaps. Its glow faded even as I watched. Alpha removed a small thong from his robe, tied it around small knobs at the top of the cruciform, and held the cross over my head. "You will be of the cruciform now and forever," he said. "Now and forever," echoed the Bikura. "Amen," I whispered. Beta signaled that I should open the front of my robe. Alpha lowered the small cross until it hung around my neck. It felt cool against my chest. The back of it was perfectly flat, perfectly smooth. The Bikura stood. Let's try that sentence again before I get lost again. The Bikura stood and wandered toward the cave entrance, apparently apathetic and indifferent once again. I watched them leave, and then I gingerly touched the cross, lifted and inspected it. The cruciform was cool, inert. If it had truly been living a few seconds earlier, it showed no sign of it now. It continued to feel more like coral than crystal or rock, but there was no sign of any adhesive material on the smooth back of it. I speculated on photochemical effects that would have created the luminescent quality. I speculated on natural phosphors, bioluminescence, and on the chances that evolution would shape such things. I speculated on what, if anything, their presence here had to do with the labyrinth, and on the eons necessary to raise this plateau so the river and canyon could slice through one of the tunnels. I speculated on the basilica and its makers, on the Bikura, on the Shrike, and on myself. Eventually, I ceased speculating and closed my eyes to pray. When I emerged from the cave, the cruciform cool against my chest under the robe, the 10 were obviously ready to begin the 3-kilometer climb up the staircase. I looked up to see a pale slash of morning sky between the walls of the cleft. "No!" I shouted, my voice almost lost against the roar of the river. "I need rest! Rest!" I sank to my knees on the sand, but half a dozen of the Bikura approached, pulled me gently to my feet, and moved me toward the staircase. I tried, the Lord knows that I tried, but 2 or 3 hours into the climb I felt my legs give way, and I collapsed, sliding across the rock, unable to stop my 600-meter fall to the rocks and river. I remember grasping at the cruciform under the thick robe, and then half a dozen hands stopped my slide, lifted me, carried me. Then I remember no more. Until this morning. I awoke to a sunrise pouring light through the opening of my hut. I wore only the robe, and a touch assured me that the cruciform was still hanging from its fibrous thong. As I watched the sun lift over the forest, I realized that I had lost a day, that somehow I had slept through not only my ascent up that endless staircase — how could these little people carry me 2.5 vertical kilometers? — but through the next day and night as well. I looked around my hut. My comlog and other recording devices were gone. Only my med scanner and a few packets of anthropological software made useless by the destruction of my other equipment remained. I shook my head and went up to the stream to wash. The Bikura appeared to be sleeping.
Now that I had participated in their ritual and become of the cruciform, they seemed to have lost interest in me. As I stripped to bathe, I decided to take no interest in them. I decided that I would leave as soon as I was strong enough. I would find a way around the flame forests if necessary. I could descend the staircase and follow the Khans if I had to. I knew more than ever that word of these miraculous artifacts had to be brought to the outside world. I pulled off the heavy robe, stood pale and shivering in the morning light, and went to lift the small cruciform from my chest. It did not come off. It lay there as if it were part of my flesh. I pulled, scraped, and tore at the thong until it snapped and fell away. I clawed at the cross-shaped lump on my chest. It did not come off. It was as if my flesh had sealed itself around the edges of the cruciform. Except for the scratches from my fingernails, there was no pain or physical sensation in the cruciform or surrounding flesh, only sheer terror in my soul at the thought of this thing attached to me. After the first rush of panic subsided, I sat a minute and then hastily pulled on my robe and ran back to the village. My knife was gone, my mazer, my scissors, razor, everything that might have helped me peel back the growth on my chest. My nails left bloody tracks across the red welt and my chest. Then I remembered the med scanner. I passed the transceiver over my chest, read the disk-key display, shook my head in disbelief, and then ran an entire body scan. After a while, I keyed in a request for hard copies of the scan results and sat motionless for a very long time. I sit here now holding the image wafers. The cruciform is quite visible on both the sonic and K-cross images, as are the internal fibers that spread like thin tentacles, like roots, throughout my body. Excess ganglia radiate from a thick nucleus above my sternum to filaments everywhere, a nightmare of nematodes. As well as I can tell with my simple field scanner, the nematodes terminate in the amygdala and other basal ganglia in each cerebral hemisphere. My temperature, metabolism, and lymphocyte level are normal. There has been no invasion of foreign tissue. According to the scanner, the nematodic filaments are the result of extensive but simple metastasis. According to the scanner, the cruciform itself is composed of familiar tissue. The DNA is mine. I am of the cruciform. Day 116. Each day I pace the confines of my cage. The flame forests to the south and east, the forested ravines to the northeast, and the cleft to the north and west. The 70 will not let me descend into the cleft beyond the basilica. The cruciform will not let me get more than 10 kilometers from the cleft. At first I could not believe this. I had resolved to enter the flame forests, trusting to luck and to God's help to see me through. But I had gone no more than 2 kilometers into the fringes of the forest when pain struck me in the chest and arms and head. I was sure that I was having a massive heart attack, but as soon as I turned back toward the cleft, the symptoms ceased. I experimented for some time, and the results were invariably the same. Whenever I ventured deeper into the flame forest, away from the cleft, the pain would return and increase in severity until I turned back. I begin to understand other things. Yesterday I happened across the wreckage of the original seed ship shuttle as I explored to the north. Only a rusted, vine-enmeshed wreck of metal remains among the rocks at the edge of the flame forest near the ravine. But crouching among the exposed alloy ribs of the ancient craft, I could imagine the rejoicing of the 70 survivors, their short voyage to the cleft, their eventual discovery of the basilica, and what? Conjectures beyond that point are useless, but suspicions remain. Tomorrow I will attempt another physical exam of one of the Bikura. Perhaps now that I am of the cruciform, they will allow it. Each day I do a med scan of myself. The nematodes remain, perhaps thicker, perhaps not. I am convinced that they are purely parasitic, although my body has shown no signs of this. I peer at my face in the pool near the waterfall, and see only the same long, aging countenance that I have learned to dislike in recent years. This morning, while gazing at my image in the water, I opened my mouth wide, half thinking that I would see grey filaments and nematode clusters growing from the roof of my mouth and the back of my throat. There was nothing. Day 117. The Bikura are sexless. Not celibate, or hermaphroditic, or undeveloped. Sexless. They are as devoid of external or internal genitalia as a child's flow-foam doll. There is no evidence that the penis or testes or comparable female organs have atrophied or been surgically altered. There is no sign that they ever existed. Urine is conducted through a primitive urethra terminating in a small chamber contiguous with the anus, a sort of crude cloaca. Cloaca. Beta allowed the examination. The med scanner confirmed what my eyes would not believe. Del and Theta also agreed to be scanned. I have absolutely no doubt that the rest of the 70 are equally sexless. There is no sign that they have been altered. I would suggest that they had all been born that way, but from what kind of parents? And how do these sexless lumps of human clay plan to reproduce? It must be tied in with the cruciform in some way. When I was finished with their med scans, I stripped and studied myself. The cruciform rises from my chest like pink scar tissue, but I am still a man. For how long? Day 133. Alpha is dead. I was with him 3 mornings ago when he fell. We were about 3 kilometers east, hunting for chalma tubers in the large boulders near the edge of the cleft. It had been raining most of the past 2 days, and the rocks were quite slippery. I looked up from my own scrambling just in time to see Alpha lose his footing and go sliding down a broad slab of stone over the edge. He did not shout. The only sound was the rasp of his robe against the rock, followed several seconds later by the sickening, dropped melon sound of his body striking a ledge 80 meters below. It took me an hour to find a route down to him. Even before I began the treacherous descent, I knew it was too late to help. But it was my duty. Alpha's body was half wedged between 2 large rocks. He must have died instantly. His arms and legs were splintered, and the right side of his skull had been crushed. Blood and brain tissue clung to the wet rock like the refuse of a sad picnic. I wept as I stood over the little body. I do not know why I wept, but I did. And as I wept, I administered extreme unction and prayed that God would accept the soul of this poor, sexless little person. Later, I wrapped the body in vines, laboriously climbed the 80 meters of cliff, and, pausing frequently to pant with exhaustion, pulled the broken corpse up to me. There was little interest as I carried the body of Alpha into the Bikura village. Eventually, Beta and half a dozen others wandered over to stare down indifferently at the corpse. No one asked me how he had died. After a few minutes, the small crowd dispersed. Later, I carried Alpha's body to the promontory where I had buried Took so many weeks earlier. I was digging the shallow grave with a flat stone when Gamma appeared. The Bikura's eyes widened, and for a brief second I thought I saw emotion across those bland features. "What are you doing?" asked Gamma. "Burying him." I was too tired to say more. I leaned against a thick chalma root and rested. "No," it was a command. "He is of the cruciform." I stared as Gamma turned and walked quickly back to the village.
When the Bikura was gone, I pulled off the crude fibre tarp I had draped over the corpse. Alpha was, without any doubt, truly dead. It no longer mattered to him or the universe whether he was of the cruciform or not. The fall had stripped him of most of his clothes and all of his dignity. The right side of his skull had been cracked and emptied like a breakfast egg. One eye stared sightlessly toward Hyperion's sky through a thickening film, while the other looked out lazily from under a drooping lid. His rib cage had been splintered so thoroughly that shards of bone protruded from his flesh. Both arms were broken, and his left leg had been twisted almost off. I had used the med scanner to perform a perfunctory autopsy, and it had revealed massive internal injuries. Even the poor devil's heart had been pulped by the force of the fall. I reached out and touched the cold flesh. Rigor mortis was setting in. My fingers brushed across the cross-shaped welt on his chest, and I quickly pulled my hand away. The cruciform was warm.
Stand away.
I looked up to see Beta and the rest of the Bikura standing there. I had no doubt that they would murder me in a second if I did not move away from the corpse. As I did so, an idiotically frightened part of my mind noted that the 70 were now the 69. It seemed funny at the time. The Bikura lifted the body and moved back toward the village. Beta looked at the sky, looked at me, and said,
It is almost time. You will come.
We went down into the cleft. The body was carefully tied into a basket of vines and lowered with us. The sun was not yet illuminating the interior of the basilica when they set Alpha's corpse on the broad altar and removed his remaining rags. I do not know what I expected next. Some ritual act of cannibalism, perhaps. Nothing would have surprised me. Instead, one of the Bikura raised his arms, just as the first shafts of coloured light entered the basilica, and intoned, "You will follow the cross all of your days." The 70 knelt and repeated the sentence. I remained standing. I did not speak. "You will be of the cruciform all of your days," said the little Bikura, and the basilica echoed to the chorus of voices repeating the phrase. Light, the colour and texture of clotting blood, threw a huge shadow of the cross on the far wall. "You will be of the cruciform now and forever and ever," came the chant as the winds rose outside and the organ pipes of the canyon wailed with the voice of a tortured child. When the Bikura stopped chanting, I did not whisper Amen. I stood there while the others turned and left with the sudden, total indifference of spoiled children who have lost interest in their game. "There is no reason to stay," said Beta when the others had gone. "I want to," I said, expecting a command to leave. Beta turned without so much as a shrug and left me there. The light dimmed. I went outside to watch the sun set, and when I returned, it had begun. Once, years ago in school, I saw a time-lapse holo showing the decomposition of a kangaroo mouse. A week's slow work of nature's recycling had been accelerated to 30 seconds of horror. There was the sudden, almost comic bloating of the little corpse, and then the stretching of the flesh into lesions, followed by the sudden appearance of maggots in the mouth, eyes, and open sores, and finally the sudden and incredible corkscrew cleaning of meat from bones. There is no other phrase that fits the image. As the pack of maggots spiraled right to left, head to tail, in a time-lapsed helix of carrion consumption that left behind nothing but bones and gristle and hide. Now it was a man's body I watched. I stopped and stared, the last of the light fading quickly. There was no sound in the echoing silence of the basilica, except for the pounding of my pulse in my own ears. I stared as Alpha's corpse first twitched and then visibly vibrated, almost levitating off the altar in the spastic violence of sudden decomposition. For a few seconds the cruciform seemed to increase in size and deepen in color, glowing as red and as raw meat, and I imagined then that I caught a glimpse of the network of filaments and nematodes holding the disintegrating body together like metal fibers in a sculptor's melting model. The flesh flowed. I stayed in the basilica that night. The area around the altar remained lit by the glow of the cruciform on Alpha's chest. When the corpse moved, the light would cast strange shadows on the walls. I did not leave the basilica until Alpha left on the third day, but most of the visible changes had taken place by the end of that first night. The body of the Bikura I had named Alpha was broken down and rebuilt as I watched. The corpse that was left was not quite Alpha and not quite not Alpha, but it was intact. The face was a flow-foam doll's face, smooth and unlined, features stamped in a slight smile. At sunrise of the third day, I saw the corpse's chest begin to rise and fall, and I heard the first intake of breath, a rasp like water being poured into a leather pouch. Shortly before noon, I left the basilica to climb the vines. I followed Alpha. He has not spoken, will not reply. His eyes have a fixed, unfocused look, and occasionally he pauses. He pauses as if he hears distant voices calling. No one paid attention to us when we returned to the village. Alpha went to a hut, and sits there now. I sit in mine. A minute ago I opened my robe and ran my fingers across the welt of the cruciform. It lies benignly under the flesh of my chest, waiting. Day 140. I am recovering from my wounds and the loss of blood. It cannot be cut out with a sharpened stone. It does not like pain. I lost consciousness long before the pain or loss of blood demanded it. Each time I awoke and resumed cutting, I would be made to pass out. It does not like pain. Day 158. Alpha speaks some now. He seems duller, slower, and only vaguely aware of me, or anyone else. But he eats and moves. He appears to recognize me to some extent. The med scanner shows the heart and internal organs of a young man, perhaps of a boy of 16. I must wait about another Hyperion month and 10 days, about 50 days in all, until the flame forests become quiet enough for me to try to walk out, pain or no pain. We will see who can stand the most pain. Day 173. Another death. The one called Will, the one with the broken finger, had been missing for a week. Yesterday the Bikura went several kilometers northeast, as if following a beacon, and found the remains near the great ravine. Evidently a branch had snapped while he was climbing to grasp some chalma fronds. Death must have been instantaneous when he broke his neck, but it is where he fell that is important. The body, if one could call it that, was lying between two great mud cones, marking the burrows of the large red insects that Took called fire mantises. Carpet beetles might have been a more apt phrase. In the past few days the insects had stripped the corpse clean to the bone. Little was left to be found except the skeleton, some random shreds of tissue and tendon, and the cruciform, still attached to the rib cage like some splendid cross packed in the sarcophagus of a long-dead pope. It is terrible, but I cannot help but feel some small sense of triumph beneath the sadness. There is no way that the cruciform can regenerate something out of these bare bones. Even the terrible illogic of this accursed parasite must respect the imperative of the law of conservation of mass. The Bikura I called Will has died the true death. The 70 truly are the 69 from this time on. Day 174.
I am a fool. Today I inquired about Will, about his dying the true death. I was curious at the lack of reaction from the Bikura. They had retrieved the cruciform, but left the skeleton lying where they had found it. There was no attempt to carry the remains to the basilica. During the night I had become concerned that I would be made to fill the role of the missing member of the 70.
It is very sad, I said, that one of you has died the true death. What is to become of the 70?
Beta stared at me.
He cannot die the true death, said the bold little androgyne. He is of the cruciform.
Somewhat later, while continuing my med scans of the tribe, I discovered the truth. The one I have tagged as Theta looks the same and acts the same, but now carries 2 cruciforms embedded in his flesh. I have no doubt that this is one Bikura who will tend toward corpulence in coming years, swelling and ripening like some obscene E. coli cell in a petri dish. When he/she/it dies, 2 will leave the tomb, and the 70 will be complete once more. I believe I am going mad. Day 195. Weeks of studying that damn parasite and still no clue as to how it functions. Worse, I no longer care. What I care about now is more important. Why has God allowed this obscenity? Why have the Bikura been punished this way? Why was I chosen to suffer their fate? I ask these questions in nightly prayers, but I hear no answers, only the blood song of the wind from the cleft. Day 214. The last 10 pages should have covered all my field notes and technical conjectures. This will be my last entry before attempting the quiescent flame forest in the morning. There is no doubt that I have discovered the ultimate in stagnant human societies. The Bikura have realized the human dream of immortality, and have paid for it with their humanity and their immortal souls. Edward, I have spent so many hours wrestling with my faith, my lack of faith. But now, in this fearful corner of an all but forgotten world, riddled as I am with this loathsome parasite, I have somehow rediscovered a strength of belief the likes of which I have not known since you and I were boys. I now understand the need for faith. Pure, blind, fly in the face of reason, faith. As a small life-preserver in the wild and endless sea of a universe ruled by unfeeling laws and totally indifferent to the small, reasoning beings that inhabit it. Day after day I've tried to cleave the cleft area, and day after day I've suffered pain so terrible that it has become a tangible part of my world, like the too small sun or the green and lapis sky. Pain has become my ally, my guardian angel, my remaining link with humanity. The cruciform does not like pain. Nor do I, but, like the cruciform, I am willing to use it to serve my purposes. And I will do so consciously, not instinctively, like the mindless mass of alien tissue embedded in me. This thing only seeks a mindless avoidance of death by any means. I do not wish to die, but I welcome pain and death rather than an eternity of mindless life. Life is sacred. I still hold to that as a core element of the Church's thought and teachings these past 2,800 years, when life has been so cheap. But even more sacred is the soul. I realize now that what I was trying to do with the Armagas data was to offer the Church not a rebirth, but only a transition to a false life, such as these poor walking corpses inhabit. If the Church is meant to die, it must do so, but do so gloriously, in the full knowledge of its rebirth in Christ. It must go into the darkness not willingly, but well, bravely and firm of faith, like the millions who have gone before us, keeping faith with all those generations facing death in the isolated silence of death camps, and nuclear fireballs, and cancer wards, and pogroms, going into the darkness, if not hopefully, then prayerfully, that there is some reason for it all, something worth the price of all that pain, all those sacrifices. All those before us have gone into the darkness without assurance of logic or fact or persuasive theory, but only a slender thread of hope or the all too shakeable conviction of faith. And if they have been able to sustain that slim hope in the face of darkness, then so must I, and so must the Church. I no longer believe that any surgery or treatment can cure me of the thing that infests me, but if someone can separate it and study it and destroy it, even at the cost of my death, I will be well satisfied. The flame forests are as quiet as they will ever be. To bed now. I leave before dawn. Day 215. There is no way out. 14 kilometers into the forest. Stray fires and bursts of current, but penetrable. 3 weeks of walking would have got me through. The cruciform will not let me go. The pain was like a heart attack that would not stop. Still, I staggered forward, stumbling and crawling through the ash. Eventually, I lost consciousness. When I came to, I was crawling toward the cleft. I would turn away, walk a kilometer, crawl 50 meters, then lose consciousness again and awake back where I had started. All day, this insane battle for my body went on. Before sunset, the Bikura entered the forest, found me 5 kilometers from the cleft, and carried me back. Dear Jesus, why have you let this be? There is no hope now, unless someone comes looking for me. Day 223. Again the attempt. Again the pain. Again the failure. Day 257. I am 68 standard years old today. Work goes on with the chapel I am building near the cleft. Attempted to descend to the river yesterday, but was turned back by Beta and 4 others. Day 280. 1 local year on Hyperion. 1 year in purgatory. Or is it hell? Day 311. Working on quarrying stones on the ledges below the shelf where the chapel is going up, and I made the discovery today. The arrestor rods. The Bikura must have thrown them over the edge when they murdered Took that night 223 days ago. These rods would allow me to penetrate the flame forest at any time if the cruciform would allow it. But it will not. If only they had not destroyed my medkits with the painkillers. But still, sitting here holding the rods today, I have an idea. My crude experiments with the med scanner have continued. 2 weeks ago, when Theta broke his leg in 3 places, I observed the reaction of the cruciform. The parasite did its best to block the pain. Theta was unconscious much of the time, and his body was producing incredible quantities of endorphins. But the break was a very painful one, and after 4 days the Bikura slashed Theta's throat and took his body to the basilica. It was easier for the cruciform to resurrect his corpse than to tolerate such pain over a long period. But before his murder, my scanner showed an appreciable retreat of the cruciform nematodes from some parts of the central nervous system. I do not know if it would be possible to inflict on oneself, or to tolerate, levels of non-lethal pain sufficient to drive the cruciform out completely, but I am sure of one thing. The Bikura would not allow it. Today I sit on a ledge below the half-finished chapel, and I consider possibilities. Day 438. The chapel is finished. It is my life's work. Tonight, when the Bikura went down into the cleft for their daily parody of worship, I said Mass at the altar of the newly erected chapel. I had baked bread from chalma flour, and I am sure that it must have tasted of that bland yellow leaf, but to me the taste was exactly like that of the first host I had partaken of during my first Holy Communion in Villefranche-sur-Saône, some 60 standard years earlier, which is to say, really bland. I don't know if y'all have ever eaten a communion wafer for any particular reason. They're pretty bland. Almost insultingly bland.
For the body of some 2,000-year-old dead guy, you'd think there'd be a bit more flavor, am I right? Sacrilegious.
The consecrated wine was only water, but in the dim light of sunset it looked blood-red and tasted of communion wine. The trick will be to penetrate deep enough into the flame forest. I will have to trust that there is enough incipient activity in and from the Tesla trees even during the quiet periods. Goodbye, Edward. I doubt if you are still alive, and should you be, I see no way that we could ever be reunited, separated as we are not only by years of distance, but by a much wider gulf in the form of a cross. My hope of seeing you again shall not be placed on this life, but on the one to come. Strange to hear me speak like this again, is it not? I must tell you, Edward, that after all these decades of uncertainty, and with great fear of what lies ahead, my heart and soul are none the less at peace. O my God, I am heartily sorry for having offended thee, and I detest all my sins, because of the loss of heaven and the pains of hell, but most of all because I have offended thee, my God, who art all good and deserving of all my love. I firmly resolve, with the help of thy grace, to confess my sins, to do penance, and to amend my life. Amen. 2400 hours. The sunset comes through the open chapel window and bathes the altar, the crudely carved chalice, and me in light. The wind from the cleft rises in the last such chorus that, with luck and God's mercy, I will ever hear.
That is the final entry, said Lenar Hoyt.
When the priest quit reading, the 6 pilgrims at the table raised their faces toward him as if they were awakening from a common dream. The consul glanced upward and saw that Hyperion was much closer now, filling a third of the sky, banishing the stars with its cold radiance.
I arrived some 10 weeks after I had last seen Father Duray,
continued Father Hoyt. His voice was a hoarse rasp.
More than 8 years had passed on Hyperion. 7 years since the last entry in Father Duray's journal.
The priest was visibly in pain now, his face paled to a sick luminescence, and filmed with perspiration.
Within a month I found my way to Perusal Plantation, upriver from Port Romance, he continued, forcing some strength into his voice. My assumption was that the fiberplastic growers might tell me the truth, even if they would have nothing to do with the consulate or home rule authorities. I was right. The administrator at Perusal, a man named Orlandi, remembered Father Duray, as did Orlandi's new wife, the woman named Sempha, who Father Duray mentioned in his journals. The plantation manager had tried to mount several rescue operations onto the plateau, but an unprecedented series of active seasons in the flame forests had made them abandon their attempts. After several years, they had given up hope that Duray or their man Took could still be alive. Nonetheless, Orlandi recruited 2 expert bush pilots to fly a rescue expedition up the cleft in 2 plantation skimmers. We stayed in the cleft itself for as long as we could, trusting to terrain avoidance instruments and luck to get us to Bikura country. Even with bypassing most of the flame forest that way, we lost one of the skimmers and 4 people to Tesla activity.
Father Hoyt paused and swayed slightly. Gripping the edge of the table to steady himself, he cleared his throat and said,
There's little else to tell. We located the Bikura village. There were 70 of them, each as stupid and uncommunicative as Dure's notes had suggested. I managed to ascertain from them that Father Dure had died while trying to penetrate the flame forest. The Bestos pouch had survived, and in it we found his journals and medical data. Hoyt looked at the others a second, and then glanced down. We persuaded them to show us where Father Dure had died, he said. They had not buried him. His remains were badly burned and decomposed, but complete enough to show us that the intensity of the Tesla charges had destroyed the cruciform as well as his body. Father Dure had died the true death. We returned the remains to the Perusal plantation where he was buried, following a full funeral mass. Hoyt took a deep breath. Over my strong objections, M. Orlandi destroyed the Bikura village and a section of the cleft wall with shaped nuclear charges he had brought from the plantation. I do not believe that any of the Bikura could have survived. As far as we could tell, the entrance to the labyrinth and the so-called basilica also must have been destroyed in the landslide. I had sustained several injuries during the expedition, and thus had to remain at the plantation for several months before returning to the northern continent and booking passage to Pachem. No one knows of these journals or their contents except M. Orlandi, Monsignor Edouard, and whichever of his superiors Monsignor Edouard chose to tell. As far as I know, the Church has issued no declaration relating to the journals of Father Paul Dure. Father Hoyt had been standing, and now he sat. Sweat dripped from his chin, and his face was blue-white in the reflected light of Hyperion.
Is that
"All?" asked Martin Silenus.
Yes, managed Father Hoyt.
gentlemen and lady? Said Hetmastine. It is late. I suggest that you gather your luggage and rendezvous at our friend the consul's ship at on Sphere 11 in 30 minutes or sooner. I will be using one of the tree's dropships to join you later.
Most of the group was assembled in less than 15 minutes. The Templars had rigged a gangway from a work pier on the interior of the sphere to the ship's top-tier balcony, and the consul led the way into the lounge as the crew clones stowed luggage and departed.
A fascinating old instrument,
Said Colonel Cassad as he ran one hand across the top of the Steinway.
harpsichord.
Piano, said the consul. Prehegira. Are we all here?
Everyone except Hoyt,
Said Braun Lamia as she took a seat in the projection pit. Het Mastine entered.
The hegemony warship has granted permission for you to descend to Keats Spaceport,
Said the captain. He glanced around.
I will send a crew member to see if M. Hoyt needs assistance.
No, said the consul. He modulated his voice. I'd like to get him. Can you tell me the way to his quarters? The tree ship captain looked at the consul for a long second, and then reached into the folds of his robe.
Bon voyage,
He said, handing over a wafer.
I will see you on the planet sometime before our midnight departure time from the Shrike's Temple in Keats.
The consul bowed. It was a pleasure traveling within the protective branches of the tree, Het Mastine, he said formally. Turning to the others, he gestured. Please make yourselves comfortable in the lounge or the library on the deck below us. The ship will see to your needs and answer any questions you might have. We will depart as soon as Father Hoyt and I return. The priest's environment pod was halfway up the tree ship, far out on a secondary branch. As the consul expected, the comlog direction wafer Het Mastine had given him also served as a palmlock override. After useless minutes tapping the announcer chime and pounding on the access portal, the consul triggered the override and stepped into the pod. Father Hoyt was on his knees, writhing in the center of the grass carpet.
Bedclothes, gear, garments, and the contents of a standard medkit were strewn on the floor around him. He had torn off his tunic and collar and sweated through his shirt so that it now hung in damp folds, ripped and tattered where he had clawed through the fabric. Hyperion light seeped through the pod wall, making the bizarre tableau appear to be staged underwater. Or, thought the consul, in a cathedral. Lenar Hoyt's face contorted in agony as his hands raked at his chest. Muscles on his exposed forearms writhed like living creatures moving beneath the pale tarp of his skin. Beneath his pale tarp of a skin. "The injector malfunctioned," gasped Hoyt. "Please!" The consul nodded, commanded the door to close, and knelt next to the priest. He removed the useless injector from Hoyt's clenched fist and ejected the Surette ampule. Ultramorphine. The consul nodded again and took out an injector from the medkit he had brought from his ship. It took less than 5 seconds to load the ultramorph. "Please!" begged Hoyt. His whole body spasmed. The consul could almost see the waves of pain passing through the man. "Yes," said the consul. He took a ragged breath. "But first, the rest of the story." Hoyt stared, reached weakly for the injector. Sweating himself now, the consul held the instrument just out of reach. "Yes, in a second," he said. "After the rest of the story. It's important that I know." "Oh, God! Sweet Christ!" sobbed Hoyt. "Please!" "Yes!" gasped the consul. "Yes, as soon as you tell me the truth." Father Hoyt collapsed onto his forearms, breathing in quick pants. "You fucking bastard!" he gasped. The priest took several deep breaths, held one until his body quit shaking, and tried to sit up. When he looked at the consul, there was something like relief in the maddened eyes. "Then you'll give me the shot?" "Yes," said the consul. "All right," Hoyt managed in a sour whisper. "The truth. Perusal plantation. Like I said. We flew in early October. Lysias. 8 years after Duray disappeared. Oh, Christ, it hurts. Alcohol and endos don't work at all anymore. Only pure ultramorph." "Yes," whispered the consul. "It's ready, just as soon as the story is done." The priest lowered his head. Sweat dripped from his cheeks and nose onto the short grass. The consul saw the man's muscles tense as if he were going to attack. Then another spasm of pain racked the thin body, and Hoyt sagged forward. "Skimmer wasn't destroyed by the Tesla. Sempha, 2 men, and I forced down near the cleft while Orlandi searched upriver. His skimmer had to wait while the lightning storm died down. Bikura came in the night, killed Sempha, the pilot, the other man, forget his name, left me alive." Hoyt reached for his crucifix, realized that he had torn it off. He laughed briefly, stopping before the laughter turned to sobs. "They told me about the way of the cross, about the cruciform, told me about the son of the flames. Next morning, they took me to see the sun, took me to see him." Hoyt struggled upright and clawed at his own cheeks. His eyes were wide, the ultramorph obviously forgotten, despite the pain. "About 3 kilometers into the flame forest. Big Tesla, 80, 100 meters tall, at least. Quiet then, but still a lot of charge in the air. Ash everywhere. The Bikura wouldn't get too close. Just knelt there with their goddamn bald heads bowed. But I went close. Had to.
dear God. Oh, Christ, it was him. Duray. What was left of him. He'd used a ladder to get there, maybe 4 meters up on the bole of the tree. Built a sort of platform for his feet. Broken the arrestor rods off. Little more than spikes. Then sharpened them. Must have used a rock to drive the long one through his feet into the Bestos platform and tree. His left arm, oh God, he'd pounded the stake between the radius and all the missed veins, just like the goddamn Romans. Very secure, as long as his skeleton was intact. Other hand, right hand, palm down. He'd driven the spike first, sharpened both ends. Then impaled his right hand, somehow bent the spike over. Hook. Ladder'd fallen long ago, but it was Bestos. Hadn't burned. Used it to climb up to him. Everything burned away years ago. Clothes, skin, top layers of flesh. But the Bestos pouch was still around his neck. The alloy spikes still conducted current even when I could see it, feel it, surging through what was left of his body. It still looked like Paul Duray. Important. I told Monsignor. No skin, flesh raw or boiled away, nerves and things visible, like gray and yellow roots. Christ, the smell! But it still looked like Paul Duray. I understood then. Understood it all. Somehow, even before reading the journals. Understood he'd been hanging there. Oh, dear God, 7 years. Living, dying. The cruciform forcing him to live again. Electricity surging through him every second of those 7 years. Flames, hunger, pain, death. But somehow the goddamned cruciform, leaching substance from the tree, maybe the air, the what was left, rebuilding what it could, forcing it to live, to feel the pain over and over and over. But he won. Pain was his ally. Oh, Jesus, not a few hours on the tree and then the spear and the rest, but 7 years. But he won. When I removed the pouch, the cruciform on his chest fell away also. Just fell right off. Long, bloody roots. Then the thing I'd been sure was a corpse. The man raised his head. No eyelids. Eyes baked white. Lips gone. But it looked at me and smiled. He smiled. And he died. Really died. There in my arms. The 10,000th time, but real this time. He smiled at me and died.
Hoyt stopped, communed in silence with his own pain, and then continued between bouts of clenching his teeth.
Bikura took me back to Cleft. Orlandi came the next day. Rescued me. Sympha, I couldn't. He lasered the village, burned the Bikura where they stood like stupid sheep. I didn't argue with him. I laughed. Oh, God, forgive me. Orlandi nuked the site with shaped charges they used to clear the jungle. Fiber plastic matrix.
Hoyt looked directly at the consul and made a contorted gesture with his right hand.
The painkillers worked all right at first, but every year, every day, got worse. Even in Fugue, the pain. I would have had to come back anyway. How could he? 7 years! Oh, Jesus!
and said Father Hoyt, and clawed at the carpet. The consul moved quickly, injecting the full ampule of ultramorph just under the armpit, catching the priest as he collapsed, and gently lowering the unconscious form to the floor. His vision unclear, the consul ripped open Hoyt's sweat-sodden shirt, casting the rags aside. It was there, of course, lying under the pale skin of Hoyt's chest like some great, raw, cross-shaped worm. The consul took a breath and gently turned the priest over. The second cruciform was where he had expected to find it, a slightly smaller, cross-shaped welt between the thin man's shoulder blades. It stirred slightly as the consul's fingers brushed the fevered flesh. The consul moved slowly but efficiently, packing the priest's belongings, straightening the room, dressing the unconscious man with the gentle care one would use in clothing the body of a dead family member. The consul's comlog buzzed. "We need to go," came Colonel Cassad's voice. "We're coming," replied the consul. He coded the comlog to summon crew clones to fetch the luggage, but lifted Father Hoyt himself. The body seemed to weigh nothing. The pod door dilated open, and the consul stepped out, moving from the deep shadow of the branch into the blue-green glow of the world which filled the sky. Deciding what cover story he would tell the others, the consul paused a second to look at the sleeping man's face. He glanced up at Hyperion, and then moved on. Even if the gravity field had been full Earth standard, the consul knew, the body in his arms would have been no burden. Once apparent to a child now dead, the consul walked on, knowing once again the sensation of bearing a sleeping son to bed. And that ends our latest little foray into the world of Hyperion. Not really much to say there other than yowza. This is not the wildest it gets. It's gonna get wild. Wilder. But yeah, this is your first real taste of what the Hyperion Cantos has going for it and what you've got in for you. So, hope people dug it. I got to scooch. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Looks like we got a bunch of new faces today, which is excellent. Thanks to everybody tuning in. If you are listening to this after the fact, I do read these aloud live every Friday on Free Read Fridays, starting at about 12 noonish. Usually I'm a couple of minutes late, at least lately, but I try to be on time. I do other streams throughout the week. I've got a Mecha Monday stream where I do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent. Right now we're pounding through D3 Publishers' latest effort to make a bargain basement game using the EDF formula, but this time using customizable mecha components called Custom Mech Wars, appropriately enough. It is jank, deeply jank, when it works. But it's cute. Shortly after the start of the new year, however, we'll be doing more reading stuff. We'll probably be doing the novelization, which has been translated in English for decades now, of Mobile Suit Gundam. We'll probably be starting that. Let me look at my calendar here. Maybe we'll do that for the new year. Why not? That could be fun. Either for the new year or for the week after the new year, we'll get on that. I also have a Warframe Wednesday stream. Wednesdays are a float day. I'm probably going to convert. I'm losing control of my enunciation faculties because I've been reading for nearly 4 hours. 3 hours, 50 minutes. I'll probably be converting that to another reading stream because the Hyperion Cantos is very long and I frankly have other books I want to read this year. What I'll probably do is I'll reserve that for doing
the shorter sequences, um, the in-between major stories for at least the first book. I'll have to figure out what I'm going to do for the second book portion, the second half of the Hyperion Cantos, because it's structured a bit differently, a bit more traditionally, if you will. But yeah, with that, I got to scoot. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. And again, these are really rough because I do them live. Stay safe, stay sane, be toasty or cool as per your preference or geolocation permits, and be decent to each other. Alrighty, until next time, bye bye.